The night began, as it often did in Victorian England, with the quiet hiss of a lamp and the soft clink of glass vials. In the dim glow of drawing rooms and sickbeds, doctors moved like spectral figures, carrying bottles filled with liquids that promised relief, yet whispered danger. Mothers were handed morphine as calmly as they were given tea. Infants were soothed with laudanum-laced syrups, and when sleep would not come or when pain grew louder than prayer, chloroform drifted through bedrooms like a perfumed fog, gentle, elegant, and often deadly. What made these cures so beloved was not their safety but their seduction. Morphine eased childbirth so completely that many women begged for it, unaware of the chains forming quietly beneath their skin. Chloroform floated through hospitals, parlors, and even fashionable gatherings, admired for its ability to erase consciousness with a single sweet breath. Victorian medicine wrapped itself in velvet manners and silver instruments, but beneath it all was a world fueled by narcotics, blind trust, and a terrifying faith in the unseen. Subscribe and stay with me. There are more shadows to follow, more rooms to enter, and more bottles whose labels hid far more than they revealed. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The past is never as harmless as it looks beneath lamplight. The bottle rested on the mantel as though it had always belonged there, its glass faintly amber, its surface catching the morning light like a small, trapped sunrise. Someone had wrapped a thin satin ribbon around its neck long ago, perhaps to soften its appearance, perhaps to make it look less like a remedy and more like a gift. In Victorian England, medicines often pretended to be luxuries. The more dangerous they were, the more carefully they were dressed. This one was no different. A delicate label curled across its front, inked in an elegant script that promised relief, comfort, and gentle restoration. It did not promise truth. The room around it smelled faintly of lavender and coal smoke, a mixture so familiar that it felt like a second skin to the house. Curtains hung heavy at the windows, filtering the pale winter sun into threads of silver. The fire snapped quietly in the grate, licking at the logs with a restless hunger. Everything was still, save for the quiet ticking of a mantel clock and the faraway sound of carriage wheels against damp cobblestone. In this calm, the ribboned bottle seemed harmless, decorative even. Only those who had opened it knew better. Mrs. Elsbeth Harrow noticed the bottle each morning as she smoothed the dust cloth across the mantel, careful not to disturb it. She had learned very quickly that in a home such as this, certain objects were not to be moved, questioned, or even touched too boldly. The mistress of the house called it her tonic, a word that made it sound light, whimsical, something one might sip after supper or take on a chilly evening to warm the bones. But Elsbeth had seen enough in her years of service to recognize the look in her mistress's eyes when she reached for it. The soft desperation, the tremor just beneath her gloved hand, the way she lingered afterward as though the world had suddenly become kinder. The tonic held morphine, though the house never spoke the word. In polite society, it was considered unseemly to name the ingredients of one's comforts. Better to let them remain behind the silk curtains of suggestion. Doctors, too, preferred elegance over clarity. They assured their patients that such treatments were perfectly safe when taken as instructed. And so households all over London kept bottles exactly like this one, ribboned, perfumed, reassuring, dangerous. On this particular morning, the mistress descended the staircase with a slowness that worried Elsbeth. Her hand grazed the banister, as though the wood might vanish if she leaned on it too heavily. The pale violet of her gown shimmered with each step, but her face appeared washed of colour, haunted softly by the night before. She paused at the bottom, eyes drifting immediately to the mantel. The bottle sat waiting. Elsbeth could almost feel the shift in the room, the air tightening, the quiet expectation settling like dust. The mistress crossed the parlour without speaking. She lifted the bottle by its ribboned throat, drew in a thin breath, and uncorked it. That familiar, faint sweetness drifted out, weaving through the air in slow, ghostly tendrils. It smelled harmless. It always did. She poured the dose with practiced elegance, as though preparing a cup of fine tea, her hands stilled only for a moment before she brought it to her lips. Elsbeth watched, helpless, as the liquid vanished and the mistress's shoulders loosened, her eyelids softening the way petals fold at dusk. It happened so quickly, the transformation from tension to tranquility, that it would have seemed miraculous to anyone who had not witnessed its cost. Within minutes, the mistress settled into her chair by the fire, her breathing deepening, her gaze wandering. She murmured something about a headache fading, though the words were slurred with a dreamy warmth. The ribboned bottle returned to the mantel, gleaming once more like an ornament rather than a warning. Outside, the street lamps flickered weakly in the morning fog, and a thin mist curled against the windows like breath on glass. The day was beginning, and yet the house remained suspended in a quiet spell. Elsbeth resumed her cleaning, the soft cloth moving in steady circles, her eyes flicking now and then toward the mantel. The bottle waited, patient and lovely. It knew it would be needed again. The little apothecary on Grafton Street always appeared half asleep, as though the fog itself held the building in a gentle, drowsy embrace. Its windows were perpetually misted over panes of glass smudged by steam, breath, and the drifting perfume of countless tinctures. To passers-by, it seemed a place suspended between worlds, neither fully open to the street nor fully withdrawn from it. But to those who needed its quiet comforts, the shop was a sanctuary. Inside, every shelf bowed gracefully beneath rows of glass bottles. Some were clear as raindrops, others amber or cobalt, each reflecting the muted lamplight like dormant stars waiting for a touch to wake them. Powder-filled tins rested beside small porcelain dishes, and above them hung bundles of dried herbs that crackled softly whenever the front door opened. The air was warm, thick with a sweetness that whispered of laudanum, tonics, and faint metallic hints of crushed opium. Even the floorboards seemed to sigh beneath the weight of secrets. Mr. Gerard Linton, the chemist himself, moved with a practiced elegance through the narrow aisles, his coat brushing against shelves that knew him as intimately as any long-time companion. His hands were steady, remarkably steady for a man who had spent a lifetime inhaling the drifting vapors of ether and chloroform. His eyes, a pale grey softened by years of half-light, watched each customer with polite curiosity. He never hurried anyone. He never needed to. The doorbell chimed most hours of the day, calling in those who sought relief, distraction, sleep, or forgetfulness. He greeted Mrs. Harrow's mistress by name whenever she stepped through the door, her veil pulled low to hide the fatigue written across her features. He understood these visits without explanation. Many of his customers preferred silence when it came to their ailments. Victorian society valued discretion, and he offered it with the same gentleness as the medicines he dispensed. On this morning, the bell chimed softly as a new customer entered, a man in a tailored coat, his gloves still damp from the fog. He removed his hat and approached the counter with an anxious stiffness. "My wife." "She hasn't slept," the man murmured, voice strained. "Not in 2 nights. She grows more agitated by the hour." Mr. Linton nodded. Sleep was a delicate creature in London, easily frightened away by grief, by childbirth, by the relentless demands of social performance. Many believed the city itself stole sleep from its residents, its constant noise and damp chill seeping into bones and stirring unrest. Without asking further questions, the chemist brought forth a bottle from a high shelf. Its glass was smooth, tinted the faintest rose, its contents swirling with syrupy opalescence. "This will calm her," he whispered, as though soothing the very remedy he offered. He wrapped the bottle in fine paper, tied it with twine, and slid it across the counter. Only a small dose, just enough to quiet the mind. The man nodded in gratitude. though he did not notice the slight tightening around the chemist's eyes, a look that suggested a quiet unease hidden beneath professionalism. Mr. Linton had said those words often enough to know their fragility. As the customer departed, the bell chimed once more. A gust of cold air slipped in, curling low against the floor like a wary animal. Mr. Linton inhaled the sweetness around him, the perfume of narcotics that clung to his clothes, his beard, even his dreams. There were days when he could not distinguish the shop's aroma from the scent of his own skin. Still, he worked carefully, filling vials, measuring powders, stirring mixtures in porcelain mortars. His mortar bore fine lines along its rim from decades of use. Each line represented a remedy prepared for someone desperate enough to seek it. Later in the afternoon, Mrs. Harrow herself entered the shop with a written note from her mistress. Her hands trembled slightly as she passed the folded paper across the counter. Mr. Linton opened it with the same soft deliberation he brought to everything. He read the request, nodded faintly, and turned toward the shelves where the amber bottles waited like obedient soldiers. "She requires more?" he asked gently. Elsbeth lowered her gaze. "Yes, sir." The chemist selected a bottle wrapped in its customary ribbon just like the first. He paused for a moment, fingertips lingering against the smooth glass. There was a heaviness in his expression, a flicker of conflict too subtle to put into words. But when he handed the bottle to Elsbeth, his voice remained calm, almost tender. "Tell her to be cautious," he whispered. "This is stronger than the last." Elsbeth nodded, though she knew caution was no longer part of the household's vocabulary. The mistress sought comfort the way others sought warmth in winter, with longing, with urgency, with surrender. As she stepped back into the fog-choked street, the chemist watched through the frosted glass. His silhouette became a blurred figure behind the mist, a man both healer and accomplice caught in a world where medicine soothed gently, quietly, beautifully, and sometimes not at all. The bell chimed again, calling him to the counter. Another customer, another need, another ribboned bottle waiting to change a life in ways none of them wished to name. At St. Bridget's Infirmary, where the corridors always smelled faintly of boiled linens and old prayers, Nurse Clara Vale moved like a whisper. Her steps were soft, deliberate, almost weightless, so quiet that patients often said they felt her presence before they heard it. She did not possess the brisk authority of the senior matrons, nor the loud, hurried energy of the younger apprentices. Instead, she brought a kind of gentle stillness with her, the sort found only in people who have learned to live beside suffering without letting it swallow them whole. Clara's hands were her most remarkable feature. Long-fingered, steady, cool to the touch hands that seemed to know instinctively how to soothe a fevered brow, how to hold a trembling wrist, how to measure a dose with eerie precision. Patients trusted those hands, doctors relied on them too, and in an age where morphine, laudanum, ether, and chloroform flowed as freely as tea, her quiet skill became essential. On this morning, a grey wash of light seeped through the infirmary windows, carrying with it the muted clatter of passing carriages. The ward stirred softly, a cough here, a murmur there, the rustle of sheets as someone shifted in uneasy sleep. Clara moved down the aisle between beds, her apron freshly pressed, her cap tied with practiced neatness. In her hands she carried a small wooden tray lined with glass bottles, clear, amber, and rose-tinted, each containing a remedy whose sweetness concealed a lurking weight. The first patient awaited her at the end of the ward, a young woman named Eliza Greenwood, who had been admitted 2 nights prior with a violent fever. She lay curled beneath a woolen blanket, her breaths shallow, her eyelids fluttering like trapped moths. Clara dipped a cloth into cool water and gently pressed it to the woman's forehead. Eliza exhaled a trembling sigh. "You'll rest now," Clara murmured, voice barely above the hum of the ward. "Just a little longer." Eliza's mother sat beside the bed, hands twisting anxiously in her lap. "She hasn't slept in hours," the woman whispered. The doctor said, "Perhaps a tonic?" Clara nodded. Something to ease the fever's grip. She reached for one of the amber bottles on her tray, the one containing laudanum so diluted it was nearly translucent, though still potent enough to lure the mind towards soft oblivion. She measured a small dose, her hands steady despite the knowledge that even a fraction too much could coax a patient into darker sleep than intended. Eliza swallowed obediently, her lashes lowering as the medicine threaded through her veins. The ward seemed to sigh with her, as though each patient felt the relief ripple outward. Clara remained for a moment, watching the young woman's face relax. She had seen expressions like this countless times, the slipping of tension, the surrender, the fragile quiet that followed narcotic comfort. And always, beneath her professionalism, lay the faintest prickle of unease. Medicine in these halls was both blessing and hazard. She moved on. At the far end of the ward, a man groaned softly, clutching his side where a surgeon had made a neat but brutal incision the previous evening. The scent of carbolic acid still clung to him, sharp and medicinal. Clara knew what he needed before he spoke. "Morphine," he whispered through clenched teeth. "Please." Clara hesitated only for the length of a heartbeat. The physicians had approved small doses to manage post-operative pain, but the man had already requested it twice before dawn. His eyes held that familiar desperation, the kind that comes when pain mingles with memory and begins to gnaw at sanity. She selected the syringe from her tray, drawing the liquid with careful precision. The needle glinted faintly in the morning light. Her hands did not tremble. They never did. "This will help," she said softly. When the dose took hold, the man's features eased, his breaths deepening, his pupils drifting toward a dreamy blur. Clara withdrew, placing the syringe back on her tray with a soft click. She knew he would ask again soon. They always did. By mid-morning, Clara had moved through the entire ward, cooling fevers, easing pain, guiding patients gently into states of rest that hovered uneasily between healing and oblivion. Her quiet hands offered comfort, but they also carried the weight of choices she did not make, only enacted. Outside the infirmary, church bells chimed, their notes drifting through the open windows and mingling with the drifting scent of ether from the surgical theatre across the hall. Clara paused, listening, her heart tightening with a strange, weary ache. In this era, healing often came wrapped in sweetness. Danger did, too. The Harrow Parlour was a room designed for calm, its floral wallpaper soft in colour, its curtains trailing in gentle folds, its armchairs upholstered in pastel brocade intended to soothe the eye. A mahogany piano rested in one corner, silent except for afternoons, when the mistress forced herself to play something light to mask her own unrest. Visitors often remarked that the room felt like a pocket of tranquility tucked safely away from London's harshness. They did not know about the drawer. The drawer belonged to a small writing desk that sat near the window, its brass handles polished so regularly that they glimmered even on overcast days. The desk itself was orderly, its surface arranged with careful precision. A silver inkstand, a stack of cream-coloured correspondence cards, a vase containing whatever flowers Elsbeth could salvage from the back garden. Nothing about it hinted at indulgence or indulgence's cost. But the drawer, always the top right, was where the truth lived. Inside, cushioned by a folded lace handkerchief, lay a bottle of laudanum. It was the kind sold in nearly every reputable chemist's shop, glass thick enough to survive being slipped discreetly into a handbag, its label printed in refined lettering that spared the eyes from confronting its true nature. Tincture of opium appeared in the smallest possible script. Far larger were the promises. Restorative, soothing, a highly recommended nighttime aid. For the mistress, it was all of these, and more. On this particular evening, as the city sank beneath a blanket of drizzle and carriage wheels, hissed along rain-slicked roads. The mistress returned home with trembling lips and a colourless expression. Her husband had left for yet another supper engagement, one of those gatherings where conversation was loud, laughter forced, and expectations suffocating. She had declined the invitation, claiming exhaustion. It was not entirely untrue. Elsbeth helped her remove her gloves, noticing how cold her hands were. The mistress murmured something faint about the weather, about the damp, about her nerves. She always spoke of her nerves as though they were delicate strings that vibrated at the slightest disturbance. She crossed the parlour without asking for tea, without seating herself by the fire, without requesting a shawl. She went straight to the drawer. Elsbeth watched from the doorway, her breath shallow in her chest. She knew better than to interfere. The two previous maids who had dared speak out lasted only days after attempting cautionary remarks. The mistress was not cruel, merely desperate, like many women of her station who found themselves smothered by expectation and solitude in equal measure. The drawer slid open with a soft sigh. The mistress's fingers closed around the bottle's neck. She brought it to the light and examined its contents, always dwindling, always too little left. Her lips pressed together in silent worry, though not enough worry to replace the bottle in its resting place. She poured a measure into a porcelain cup, its rim painted with tiny violets. The liquid swirled a dark, reddish amber like syrup infused with sunlight stolen at dusk. She drank. The transformation was nearly immediate, a loosening in her shoulders, a softening around her eyes, a slight sway in her posture as though the air itself had grown warmer and sweeter. She inhaled deeply, letting the warmth unfurl inside her like a silk ribbon unwinding. Elsbeth stepped forward. "Ma'am, would you like the fire lit?" The mistress blinked slowly, her voice floating like a sigh. "Yes, that would be nice." Elsbeth knelt and coaxed the embers into a gentle flame. The fire crackled softly, filling the parlour with a golden glow that blended with the laudanum's embrace. The mistress settled into her favourite chair, gazing into the flames as though they were telling her a story only she could hear. But as the room warmed, the danger grew colder. Laudanum had a way of shifting from companion to captor without changing its flavour. The mistress did not yet recognise the shift, but Elsbeth saw it clearly, saw it each night the bottle left the drawer and returned emptier, saw it in the mornings when the mistress struggled to rise, her limbs heavy, her thoughts sluggish, her eyes clouded in a way no amount of powder or rouge could disguise. Outside, the rain continued its delicate tapping against the window. Inside, the mistress drifted into her laudanum-drenched calm, unaware that the parlour drawer's velvet darkness held more than a remedy. It held a quiet, creeping ruin, one she welcomed with open hands. Dr. Alistair Whitcomb arrived at the Harrow residence each Wednesday afternoon, stepping from his carriage with a polished cane and a coat that trailed faintly behind him like a dark wing. He was a man of impeccable manners and calm expressions, the sort of physician families trusted implicitly, especially when their ailments were those best discussed behind closed doors. Yet what set him apart was not his reassuring voice or his expertly trimmed beard. It was the scent. Wherever Dr. Whitcomb walked, a ghostly sweetness followed, the unmistakable drifting fragrance of ether. It clung to his cuffs, settled into the folds of his coat, and lingered in the air long after he departed. Some said the scent alone could lull a restless mind. Others believed it signalled a man far too familiar with his own remedies. But in most drawing rooms, the fragrance was spoken of with admiration, like the perfume of a skilled gardener or a gentleman who favoured French cologne. To the mistress of the Harrow home, it was the smell of salvation. On this particular Wednesday, the household was quieter than usual. Elsbeth had been instructed to open the windows early, letting the morning fog drift in to freshen the rooms. But even the mist could not banish the stale traces of laudanum and sleeplessness that hovered faintly in the parlour. When the front door opened and Dr. Whitcomb stepped inside, the scent of ether swept through the hallway like a cool, chemical breeze, sharp yet oddly elegant. "Mrs. Harrow," he greeted with a slight bow, his voice low, warm, and gentler than any remedy he carried. "You look quite pale today. How fares the mind?" The mistress managed a thin smile. "It wanders, doctor. It wanders too often." He gestured toward the nearest chair. "Then sit. Let us quiet it." Elsbeth stood discreetly in the doorway, hands folded against her apron. She watched the doctor with quiet suspicion, a suspicion she dared not voice. There was something unsettling about the ease with which he entered the household, the familiarity with which he handled the mistress's wrist, the practiced way he opened his leather bag. Inside the bag were instruments gleaming with cold certainty. Polished syringes, glass stoppers, folded cloths, a vial or two whose contents glowed faintly when the light struck them. But the item he reached for first was always the same, a small inhaler made of metal and rubber, worn from use, yet meticulously cleaned. "Just breathe, Mrs. Harrow," he murmured as he held the mask near her lips. Only a moment of stillness, nothing more. The mistress obeyed. She inhaled. The effect was immediate, a soft shudder travelling through her, followed by a serenity so sudden it bordered on collapse. Ether settled into her lungs like cool velvet, numbing the edges of her mind, dissolving the anxieties that had plagued her for days. Her eyes half closed, her posture softened, and her breath slowed into an unnaturally delicate rhythm. "There," the doctor whispered, as though soothing a fretful child. "That is better." Elsbeth's fingers tightened against her apron. She had witnessed the process enough times to sense its danger. The doctor's treatments brought peace, yes, but peace purchased with borrowed breath and stolen clarity. The mistress always appeared diminished afterward, as though a small part of her had been smoothed away by the vapor. Dr. Whitcomb removed the mask with a flourish of calm precision. The faint sweetness of ether hung between them like a ghost caught in afternoon light. "You are fortunate," he said, folding the device back into his bag. "Many women find themselves slipping into states of agitation far worse. But your constitution, delicate as it is, responds beautifully." The mistress, dazed and dream-soft, murmured something akin to gratitude. He touched her wrist once more, his hand gentle, almost tender. "Continue the laudanum at night," he advised. "And if the headaches return, I will prepare a stronger mixture. Your health requires balance." His words, delivered in the tone of a confidant, carried the weight of inevitability. When he rose to leave, Elsbeth escorted him to the door. As he stepped onto the front walk, the ether-laced air swirled behind him, leaving a faint sting in her throat. She watched him return to his carriage, every movement smooth, measured, untroubled. Only when the wheels rattled away into the fog did she return inside. The parlour felt hollow without the doctor's presence, too quiet, too still. On the mantel, the ribboned bottle of morphine gleamed like a reminder. In the air, the fading sweetness of ether whispered a truth the household refused to face. The doctor's treatments soothed the mistress. They also claimed her one breath at a time. Pain, in Victorian England, was considered something both sacred and suspicious. Sacred, because suffering was thought to refine the spirit, yet suspicious, because it often disrupted the orderly rhythms of household life. A lady confined to her bed with headaches or trembling nerves could not host company, oversee servants, or attend evening socials. Pain was an inconvenience and an embarrassment, and thus it became something to be quieted, and quieting it became an art. In the Harrow household, this art unfolded daily, almost ritualistically. The mistress had grown accustomed to examining her discomforts the way one examines weather, noting their approach, their peaks, their retreat. She would sit before her mirror each morning, observing the pallor beneath her powder, the faint shadows blooming under her eyes, the slight pinch near her temples. Pain always announced itself in delicate ways, like a shy guest stepping into the room. Elspeth, meanwhile, had learned to anticipate its arrival. She could sense it in the way the mistress's hand hovered near her forehead, or how her voice grew brittle when responding to the simplest inquiries. And so, quietly, dutifully, she began preparing the tray. The tray was a modest silver piece polished to a pale gleam. Upon it rested a porcelain cup, a small glass of water, a folded linen cloth, and most importantly the bottle with the faded gold script that read Laudanum. The bottle's presence was never acknowledged aloud. It simply appeared where needed, as though summoned by thought alone. In the early days, the dosing had been infrequent. A teaspoon, then rest. A quiet afternoon of reading or stitching, followed by an early bedtime. But with time, the intervals between doses shrank. Pain returned quicker, sharper, less patient, and the mistress, accustomed to the remedy's warmth, learned to seek it before the ache had fully formed. On this particular evening, twilight had settled heavily across London. Gas lamps flickered like trembling stars. The parlour grew dim, its shadows stretching long along the floorboards. The mistress reclined faintly on the chaise, her hand pressed carefully against her brow. "It throbs again," she whispered. Elsbeth bowed her head. "Shall I prepare the dose, ma'am?" The mistress hesitated only for appearance's sake before nodding. Elsbeth retrieved the tray, her steps soft across the carpet. She uncorked the bottle, letting the familiar scent drift upward. A sweet, bitter fragrance that felt both medicinal and strangely comforting. She poured only a modest measure, her fingers careful as ever, though her heart tightened with each drop. The mistress sat up slightly, accepting the cup with trembling hands. She drank, her throat bobbing delicately as the laudanum slipped down like syrup. A breath escaped her long, relieved, almost affectionate. "It is a mercy," she murmured, eyes half closing. "A blessed mercy." Elsbeth said nothing. She knew better. Within moments, the mistress's posture softened. Her eyelids drooped, her voice slowed. The ache in her temples receded, replaced by a floating warmth that dulled the edges of every thought. The room itself seemed to ease its corners less sharp, its silence deeper, its air warmer. The fire crackled softly, and from outside came the muffled sound of distant horses trotting through the fog. It was then that Dr. Whitcomb's earlier words drifted back to Elsbeth's mind. "Your constitution responds beautifully." She wondered if he ever considered how many constitutions he'd coaxed into this drifting half-life. How many women sat in dim parlours, lulled into quiet compliance by his measured instructions and gentle reassurances. She wondered, too, whether pain, honest, unsoftened pain, might have been safer than this growing dependence masked as treatment. But such thoughts were not for servants. She placed the bottle back into the small drawer where it belonged. She straightened the tray. She dimmed the lamps. The mistress, now drifting in laudanum's velvet haze, whispered faintly, "Do not leave yet, Elspeth." "I'm here, ma'am," Elsbeth replied, lowering herself into the nearby chair. Her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes lingered on the bottle. In the gentle art of dosing pain, the line between healing and harm was as thin as the ribbon tied around the glass. And each evening, the line grew fainter still. In Victorian England, worry was considered an ailment in its own right, a silent, creeping affliction that settled into the chest and wrapped its tendrils around the heart. Doctors rarely used the word anxiety, preferring softer terms like nervous agitation or delicate sensibilities. Among the upper and middle classes, nearly everyone seemed to suffer from it. The world moved quickly, expectations were suffocating, reputations fragile. And so, the chemists of London offered powders designed to dissolve worry like sugar in warm tea. One such powder rested inside a tiny paper packet on the Harrow writing desk. It seemed harmless at first glance, a folded square, sealed with the faintest dab of gum, labelled with only the name of the chemist and a gentle handwritten note, to be taken when the nerves are unsettled. The paper was thin enough that the powder inside left a soft bloom of white against its surface, like the dust of moth wings. To the mistress, that bloom was reassurance itself. She discovered the powder shortly after her laudanum use deepened. Morphine soothed pain, and laudanum hushed both body and mind. But this new powder, delivered discreetly by Dr. Whitcomb, had a different promise. It promised ease. Not the heavy, sinking ease of narcotic sleep, but a floating lightness meant to silence worry before it had the chance to take hold. The powder was mild compared to the mistress's other remedies, yet, as often happened in those days, the line between mild and treacherous had a habit of disappearing altogether. On this particular evening, the mistress sat at her desk beneath the glow of a single lamp. Its yellow light cast a halo upon her hair, catching in the ribbon at her collar and in the fine tremor of her hands. She stared down at a half-written letter addressed to her sister, an invitation she was meant to respond to days ago. Her quill hovered uselessly above the page. Words should have come easily. Instead, her thoughts tangled like the thin chain of her locket. Each sentence felt too heavy to write, too revealing, too inadequate. The pressure in her chest rose slowly, tightening like a corset drawn one notch too far. Elspeth, standing near the doorway with a basket of folded linens, recognized the signs: shallow breaths, reddened eyes, the quivering mouth that tried to appear composed. "Ma'am?" she asked softly. "Shall I bring your shawl?" "No," the mistress murmured. "No, I just need a moment." Her gaze drifted toward the little packet. Elsbeth followed the glance and felt her stomach tighten, not with fear, but with a sense of inevitability. The mistress reached for the packet with the fragile decisiveness of someone choosing surrender over struggle. Her fingers unfolded the paper, releasing a faint puff of white. The powder sparkled under the lamplight, almost pretty, almost innocent. She tipped it into a small glass of water. With a single stir, the clear liquid turned faintly opalescent, shimmering softly like moonlit milk. She lifted the glass. Elsbeth's instinct compelled her forward. "Ma'am, perhaps I should fetch the doctor first." "No." The mistress's voice, though soft, carried a brittle edge. "He gave this to me so I might not trouble him again." She drank. The transformation came gently, like fog drifting across a still pond. The mistress inhaled slowly, her eyelids fluttering as the tension unwound from her shoulders. The lines around her mouth softened, the tremor in her fingers faded. She exhaled long, controlled, serene. "I can breathe again," she whispered. Elsbeth stood in silence, watching the effect spread like warmth through cold limbs. This powder did not intoxicate. It smoothed. It muffled the sharpness of worry, leaving behind a quiet calm that felt deceptively pure. But as the mistress returned to her letter, her writing hand steady now, Elsbeth noticed something else. The glassy sheen in her eyes, the faint disconnection in her expression, the way she blinked slowly, as if viewing the world through a thin veil. A veil woven not from relief, but from dependence. She finished the letter with unusual swiftness, though the lines slanted unevenly, the ink blotting where her focus wavered. When she sealed the envelope, her smile was serene but hollow. "See," she murmured, "just what I needed." Elsbeth nodded, though her heart sank. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living creature, listening. Inside, the house fell into its familiar hush. The mistress slipped deeper into her calm, unaware of the quiet danger forming beneath it, danger wrapped in thin paper, disguised as gentleness. In Victorian England, worry could indeed be erased. The troubling question was, what else disappeared with it? Addiction was not a word the Victorians cared to use. It was too sharp, too accusatory, too unbecoming for parlours draped in lace and for households that prided themselves on good breeding. Instead, they spoke in softer terms: habit, overindulgence, a delicate reliance. Anything to protect the illusion that respectable families could not possibly fall victim to the same vices as the city's poorer quarters. But in the Harrow home, the first murmurs had begun. It started with small observations barely noticeable on their own, yet unmistakable when threaded together like beads on a quiet string. Elsbeth noticed them first, as servants always did. A shift in posture, a missed meal, a trembling in the morning that vanished only after the ribboned bottle was uncorked. The mistress's eyes, once sharp even through their fatigue, now glinted with a faint shimmer that did not belong to natural light. The household followed its routines nevertheless. Breakfast was served precisely at 8. The fire was stoked in each room, the piano dusted, the curtains drawn back to let in the weak London daylight. Yet beneath this order, a subtle disarray took root, one that no feather duster or well-laid table could disguise. One rainy afternoon, as the mistress prepared to receive her weekly callers, her hands shook violently enough that she spilled a line of tea across her gown. She gasped, startled, her breath coming in shallow bursts. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she whispered. Elsbeth, who stood nearby with a tray of petite fours, saw the look in her eyes, a mixture of fear and yearning, the kind that sought refuge more than explanation. "Would you like your tonic, ma'am?" Elsbeth asked gently. The mistress hesitated, but only for a moment. Yes, quickly. It was that moment of hesitation that struck Elsbeth most. Not because it was brief, but because it was new. In the early days, the mistress took her remedies only when pain demanded it. Now she took them when pain threatened to demand it. Elsbeth fetched the ribboned bottle. The familiar clink of glass against the porcelain cup echoed softly through the room. The mistress drank, and within seconds the trembling subsided. Her shoulders relaxed, her heartbeat steadied. A calm washed over her. So sudden, it felt like a shift in weather. But this calm was not the quiet contentment it once had been. It was heavier, more consuming, a relief that arrived with a shadow trailing behind it. Later that evening, when the callers had gone and the lamps were dimmed, the mistress lingered in the parlour long after she should have retired. Elsbeth found her seated near the mantel, staring at the fire with hollow curiosity. "You should rest, ma'am," Elsbeth said softly. "I will," the mistress murmured, though her eyes drifted toward the desk drawer, the drawer where the laudanum bottle rested on its lace handkerchief. She rose unsteadily. "But first, perhaps just a little more, to settle me." Elsbeth's breath caught. "That would be your third time today, ma'am." The mistress paused in the doorway. Her fingers gripped the doorframe as though any further movement required tremendous effort. "I am aware," she said, voice low, brittle, "but it is necessary." Her footsteps softened as she crossed the parlour. The drawer opened with a sigh. Elsbeth closed her eyes. There it was the moment when need overcame reason, when the medicine commanded rather than answered. The line between use and reliance had blurred so gradually, so politely, that neither mistress nor doctor nor household had spoken the truth aloud. Yet the truth lay in the trembling hands, in the sleepless dawn hours, in the urgency that pulsed beneath each request for another dose. Outside, the lamplighters moved through the fog, unaware of the private struggle within the walls of number 14 Grafton Street. Inside, the mistress sipped her remedy and exhaled a soft, shaky sigh of relief. The murmurs of addiction were faint, still whispers, not accusations. But they were growing, and in Victorian England, whispers had a way of becoming fate. It was not unusual for babies in Victorian households to be quiet. In fact, silence was considered a mark of good parenting, an orderly nursery, a calm temperament, a mother whose nerves were not frayed by constant wailing. But sometimes silence carried a weight too heavy for comfort. Sometimes it lingered in a room long after it should have been broken by stirring or fussing or the soft, hungry cry of a waking infant. In the Harrow home, Silence settled in the nursery like an unwelcome guest. The child, little Clara May, had never been a troublesome infant. She slept easily, rarely fussed, and seemed soothed by the faintest rocking or humming. But in recent weeks, her sleep had deepened into something unnervingly still. Long stretches, where she barely shifted beneath her blankets, where her breath came so soft that Elsbeth found herself leaning close, just to be certain it continued. It began shortly after Mrs. Harrow started administering the soothing syrup. The syrup had arrived as a gift from her sister, a fashionable product sweeping across London parlours. Its advertisements promised restful sleep for infants, relief from colic, peace for mothers, and comfort for the entire household. Its label was decorated with cherubs and flowers, as though innocence itself were bottled inside. But beneath its sweet flavour lay opium, not enough to alarm a careless chemist, but enough to send a child into unnaturally deep slumber. On this grey morning, Elsbeth entered the nursery with her usual quiet steps, expecting to find Clara May stirring with the dawn. Instead, she found the room heavy with stillness. The curtains were half drawn, allowing a dim wash of light to fall across the cradle. The air smelled faintly of lavender sachets and the lingering sweetness of the syrup. Clara May lay motionless. Her tiny fist, usually curled near her cheek, rested limp against the blanket. Her eyelids fluttered faintly, but she did not wake at the sound of Elsbeth's entrance, or at the soft rustle of skirts, or even when Elsbeth gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "Little one," Elsbeth whispered, voice trembling despite her efforts. "It's morning." She lifted the child carefully. The baby was warm, but unresponsive. Her breathing was steady yet so faint that Elsbeth felt her heart tighten in her chest. She rocked her gently, humming, patting her back, but Clara May remained caught in some faraway sleep, her lashes resting like delicate shadows against her cheeks. Mrs. Harrow appeared in the doorway moments later, her hair still unpinned, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Is she awake?" Elsbeth swallowed hard. "Not yet, ma'am. She seems very drowsy." "Oh." The mistress crossed the room quickly, brushing her daughter's cheek with trembling fingers. She had a troublesome night. The syrup helped her rest. "Ma'am," Elsbeth whispered, "she's had it twice in the last 2 days." The mistress stiffened. "It is perfectly safe," the chemist assured me. Elsbeth hesitated then, cautiously. Perhaps it was too much? Silence stretched thin between them. The mistress's eyes hardened, not with anger but with something far more fragile, fear wrapped tightly in denial. "I would never harm my child," she whispered. "Never." "I know, ma'am," Elsbeth said softly. "I only worry." As the words left her lips, Clara May stirred just barely, a small twitch of her fingers, a faint wrinkle between her brows. Relief flooded Elsbeth so swiftly it left her dizzy. The mistress exhaled shakily, pressing a trembling hand to her lips. "There you see," she murmured, "just a deeper sleep. Babies are prone to it." Yet even as she spoke, she could not look away from her daughter's face, the stillness, the unnatural softness of her limbs. She gently took Clara May from Elsbeth's arms, holding her close with a tenderness sharpened by fear. "I will give her no more today," she whispered, as if confessing. Elsbeth nodded, though her heart felt heavy. She had seen too many households whisper similar promises, only for the familiar cycle to return on the next sleepless night. Convenience was a powerful seduction, and fear of disorder even more so. The nursery remained quiet, too quiet as the morning light brightened into a pale gold. In the cradle, the folded blanket still carried the faint scent of the syrup, sweet enough to disguise its danger. Downstairs, the ribboned bottle of laudanum and the powder packets awaited their mistress. Upstairs, the child slept on. In Victorian England, silence in the nursery was praised. But sometimes silence was the first warning that something precious was slipping away. Among the many curiosities tucked into London's elegant apothecaries, women's tonics occupied a category all their own. They were marketed with phrases meant to soothe the sensibilities of the respectable, for monthly discomfort, for the feminine constitution, for quieting nerves and restoring vitality. No one spoke plainly of their true contents: opium, alcohol, chloral hydrate, and sometimes ingredients so potent that even chemists whispered their names behind closed doors. What mattered most was that they worked. And for Victorian women burdened by expectations, corseted by propriety, smothered by silence, relief, however fleeting, was irresistible. Mrs. Harrow kept her tonic in a polished silver box atop her vanity. It was not a particularly ornate container, yet she guarded it more fiercely than any of her jewellery. Elsbeth recognized the box by its soft click when opened, the faint, sweet, sour aroma that escaped whenever the mistress prepared her necessary measure, and the way time itself seemed to warp after it was taken. Tonight, the Harrow home was quiet, save for the muffled patter of rain against the windows and the distant clatter of carriage wheels echoing down the street. The mistress sat before her vanity, the lamplight casting warm, wavering shadows across her pale features. Her hair, usually pinned into immaculate coils, spilled loosely over her shoulders. A tremor lingered in her fingers. Her monthly pains had arrived, sharp, relentless, exhausting, and the tactful euphemisms Victorian etiquette insisted upon did nothing to soften their severity. Elsbeth stood nearby, folding linens, though her eyes flicked repeatedly toward the silver box. The mistress's breathing had grown shallow, her movements slow. Pain crept across her expression like a storm cloud. At last, unable to bear it any longer, she whispered, "Fetch my tonic." Elsbeth set down the linens and hesitated. "Ma'am," Dr. Whitcomb said the laudanum already. "This is different," the mistress snapped, not in anger, but in desperation. "It helps. Please." Elsbeth obeyed. Servants always did in such matters. She retrieved the silver box, its surface cool beneath her fingertips. The mistress opened it with a shaky breath. Inside lay a small glass bottle filled with a translucent liquid tinged the faintest shade of pink, like watered roses. A tiny spoon accompanied it, delicate, ornamental, deceptive. The mistress lifted the bottle to her nose and inhaled, just enough to ease the ache. Elsbeth bit her lip. "Only a small measure, ma'am." "Of course," the mistress murmured, though her voice carried a thin thread of urgency. She poured the tonic into the spoon and swallowed. Her eyes fluttered closed as the liquid touched her tongue. It was sweet first, deceptively pleasant, then cooling, then warm, then subtly numbing. A sensation began to unfurl at the base of her spine, rising slowly like a tide. Elsbeth watched time shift. The mistress's shoulders sagged, the tension in her jaw softened, her breath deepened, became rhythmic, almost heavy. She blinked at the mirror, her own reflection blurring slightly around the edges, as though she viewed herself through a thin veil of fog. "I can feel it," she whispered, touching her temple. "Everything slowing, easing." Elsbeth stepped closer. "Shall I help you to bed?" "Not yet. The pain is fading. Let me sit a moment longer." But the moments stretched unnaturally, lengthening into something thick and syrupy. The mistress's eyelids drooped, her head tilted. The room around her seemed to dim, not because the lamp flickered, but because her senses dulled. The tonic was strong, stronger than she realized, stronger than any woman should ever have been given. Elsbeth steadied her as she swayed. "Ma'am, please, you must lie down." The mistress nodded sluggishly, her voice barely audible. "Everything feels so far away." Elsbeth guided her to the bed, slipping off her shoes, pulling a quilt over her trembling form. The mistress exhaled a long, slow sigh, her hand falling limply across her stomach. A faint smile touched her lips, peaceful, dreamlike, dangerously serene. "Elsbeth," she murmured, Don't let anyone take my tonic. It is the only thing that makes the world bearable." Elsbeth's heart tightened. She extinguished the lamp, leaving the room cloaked in the soft glow of streetlight seeping through lace curtains. The silver box sat closed on the vanity, innocuous, elegant, lethal. In the darkness, the mistress drifted into a sleep too deep, too silent, too suspended. Time lost its edges around her minutes, slipping into hours with no clear border between. Downstairs, the house remained still. Upstairs, the tonic continued its quiet work. In Victorian England, women endured much, and when the world offered them solace in a bottle, wrapped in sweetness and false mercy, they took it, even when it blurred time into something they could not quite return from. Of all the objects quietly entering Victorian households during this strange, perfumed age of medicine, the hypodermic syringe was the most unsettling. It arrived draped in respectability, tucked into velvet-lined cases, wrapped in linen, presented by physicians with solemn assurances. It was modern, precise, efficient, a marvel of progress, they said, and it placed power directly into the patient's hand. In the Harrow home, that power arrived on a chilly Thursday afternoon. Dr. Whitcomb had brought it personally. He unlatched a small wooden case before the mistress and revealed the instrument as though unveiling a treasured heirloom. The syringe gleamed under the parlour lamp, its metal fittings polished to a mirrored shine, its glass barrel clear as winter ice. For moments of severe discomfort, he told her with practiced gentleness, "You need not wait for my visits. Relief can be immediate." Elsbeth watched from the corner of the room, her heart pinched with dread. She had seen the mistress use laudanum, chloroform, powders, tonics, but the syringe was different. It required intention, precision, willingness, dependency. The mistress touched the gleaming instrument as though touching a relic. Her fingers trembled not from fear, but from longing. "You mean I can administer it myself?" "With my guidance at first," Dr. Whitcomb assured. "Morphine works swiftly when introduced beneath the skin. It will ease the body in minutes." Minutes. A promise as dangerous as it was tempting. He demonstrated with serene authority how to draw the liquid, how to expel the air, how to find the soft flesh just beneath the arm, where the needle could slip in with minimal pain. The mistress watched with parted lips, her breath unsteady, her eyes following every movement with a hunger that chilled Elsbeth to her core. When Dr. Whitcomb finally placed the instrument in her hand, she held it like something alive. Elsbeth cleared her throat softly. "Ma'am, perhaps the doctor should—" The mistress raised her head sharply. "I am capable, Elsbeth." Her voice was soft, but the tremor beneath it betrayed something far more fragile. She turned her gaze to Dr. Whitcomb. "Shall I try?" He nodded solemnly. "Only a small dose to begin." She drew the morphine into the barrel, her hands trembling as the liquid rose in a smooth amber ribbon. When she pressed the needle to her arm, her breath caught. Then, slowly, almost reverently, she pushed the needle through her skin. A tiny gasp escaped her lips. Elsbeth stepped forward, alarmed, but the mistress's eyes fluttered open, glazed, dreamy, already drifting into Morphine's silken fog. "I can feel it," she whispered. Her face softened. The crease between her brows dissolved, her shoulders melted into the chair like warm wax. The syringe slipped gently from her fingers, landing on the lace tablecloth with a faint, muffled click. Dr. Whitcomb smiled thinly, pride glinting in his eyes. "You see, a marvel of modern medicine." The mistress looked dazed, awestruck. "It is heavenly." Elsbeth felt her stomach twist. He instructed her on cleaning the needle, on storing it safely in its velvet-lined case. He repeated stern warnings, never more than the measured dose, never too frequently, never without caution. But the mistress heard none of the warnings. She heard only the promise of immediate escape. That evening, after the doctor left, The mistress lingered near the small wooden case as though drawn to it by an invisible thread. She opened it, closed it, opened it again. Her fingers skimmed the polished glass, the delicate metal fittings, the velvet lining that cradled the syringe like something sacred. Elsbeth stood silently by the doorway, feeling the weight of what was to come pressing down on her chest. "Elsbeth," the mistress whispered without turning, "do you understand what it means to have control of one's own relief?" Her voice trembled with something between awe and dependence. Elsbeth swallowed. "Ma'am, I fear it will hurt you." The mistress closed the box, her fingers lingering on the clasp. "It has already saved me," she murmured. "Pain no longer rules me. I decide when it ends." She lifted her chin, but her eyes were already dimmed by that earlier dose, her thoughts swimming in the remnants of morphine's warmth. Control. That was the illusion, the fragile, lethal illusion. Upstairs, the nursery remained quiet. Down the hallway, the silver box of tonic waited, hidden but not forgotten. On the mantel, laudanum gleamed like a silent accomplice. And now, in the parlour, nestled within velvet, lay the needle, the most dangerous comfort of all. The midwife arrived just after dawn, her boots damp with mist and her shawl carrying the scent of the early London streets, coal smoke, wet stone, and the faint sweetness of bakery ovens beginning their morning fires. Mrs. Ada Penhallow was well known across the neighbourhood, called upon whenever a household needed steady hands, a calm voice, and the kind of instinct that no formal training could teach. She carried her reputation the way she carried her leather satchel, with quiet pride and the weary dignity of someone who had witnessed too many births, too many tears, too many fragile beginnings. Inside the Harrow home, the atmosphere was already tense. The mistress's sister, Lydia, had gone into labour earlier than expected, her cries muffled only by the thick walls of the guest bedroom and the frantic rustling of sheets. Elsbeth had dashed between floors all morning, fetching water, towels, warming pans, anything to prepare for what promised to be a long, painful ordeal. But when Mrs. Penhallow stepped into the room, she brought with her a strange calm, as though she carried serenity folded beneath her shawl. "Now then," she murmured, closing the door behind her, "let us see to the mother, and bring this little soul safely into the world." She set her satchel upon the small table near the bed. The mistress, pale but composed, remained by her sister's side, offering water and whispered reassurances. Lydia writhed in the sheets, her breaths ragged, her hair plastered to her forehead. The room smelled of sweat and fear, and the iron scent of imminent birth. "Her pains are too sharp," the mistress whispered anxiously. "She's been like this for hours." Mrs. Penhallow nodded, unflustered. "Some labours are long, some short. All must be endured." She paused then, with a glance toward her satchel, added quietly, "But we can make the enduring gentler." Elsbeth felt her heart tighten. The midwife unlatched the satchel and withdrew a small glass vial. It was no larger than a thumb, filled with a pale, amber liquid that seemed to glow softly even in the grey morning light. The mistress recognized it instantly. "Morphine?" she breathed. Mrs. Penhallow nodded. "A modest dose eases the worst of the agony. It helps the mother rest between contractions, rest that may spare her strength." Elsbeth's unease deepened. She had seen what morphine did, how it softened reality, blurred senses, seduced with quiet warmth. Given to a woman in the throes of childbirth, it could be both blessing and peril. But midwives across London had embraced the vial in recent years. Doctors hailed it as a miracle, and families, eager to lessen the brutality of labour, welcomed it without hesitation. Lydia whimpered, her entire body arching with pain. "Please," she gasped, "please, make it stop." The midwife wasted no time. She prepared the dose with practiced efficiency, her hands steady as she filled a small syringe, nothing as fine or polished as Dr. Whitcomb's, but formidable in its purpose. She turned Lydia's arm gently and slipped the needle beneath the skin. The effect came swiftly. Lydia's sobs softened into whimpers. Her breathing slowed. Her body relaxed into the mattress as though the weight of her suffering had been temporarily lifted. Her eyelids fluttered, her lips parted in a faint sigh. "There," Mrs. Penhallow murmured with satisfaction. "The worst of it has passed, for now." The mistress exhaled in relief. Thank heaven. But Elsbeth's chest tightened as she watched Lydia sink deeper into the drug's embrace. Her head lolled to the side. Her voice became thick, distant, dreamlike. The contractions continued sharp, unrelenting, but Lydia drifted through them, half aware, half absent. Time in the room began to feel suspended. Hours passed in a haze. The midwife worked dutifully, monitoring the labor with quiet precision. But each time Lydia cried out, her voice held a strange, delayed quality, like sound echoing through fog. Her movements grew sluggish, her reactions dulled. When she reached for her sister's hand, her fingers trembled weakly. "She's too pale," Elsbeth whispered when the midwife stepped aside to wash her hands. Mrs. Penhallow frowned but brushed it off. "Morphine does that. It's the body learning to let go of fear." But Elsbeth noticed something else. Lydia's breathing had become shallow. Her pulse, when Elsbeth held her wrist, was slower, too slow. The midwife returned to the bedside and, for the first time that morning, unease flickered across her face. "She needs to push," she said briskly. "Help her sit up." The room erupted into motion, pillows arranged, towels laid out, hands guiding Lydia upright. But Lydia's eyes fluttered, unfocused. The morphine had softened her pain, yes, but it had also softened her strength. "Come now, dear," Mrs. Penhallow urged. "You must give us your effort." Lydia tried, her face twisted, her fingers clutched weakly at her sister, but her body, wrapped still in the drug's velvet fog, could not meet the moment with the ferocity it required. "You gave too much," Elsbeth whispered before she could stop herself. The midwife shot her a sharp look, but not one of anger, one of fear. Outside, rain began its slow tap against the windows. Inside, the air tightened around them. Lydia sagged forward, breath shallow, eyes flickering like dying candlelight. And the vial empty now lay upon the table, its amber residue clinging softly to the glass like the ghost of a choice that could not be undone. In Victorian England, midwives and mothers embraced the vial with trust. But trust, once given, could not always be reclaimed. Labor was meant to be a battle raw, painful, and fought with every breath. But under the influence of morphine, Lydia Harrow's childbirth took on an eerie, unreal quality, as though she were drifting through someone else's ordeal. The room around her, a modest guest chamber with lace curtains and a faint rosewater scent, seemed to fade in and out of focus like a half-remembered dream. Mrs. Penhallow had dimmed the lamps to soothe the mother-to-be, but the effect was unsettling. Shadows pooled in the corners. The soft golden glow flickered over Lydia's pale skin, making her appear almost luminous, ethereal, as though she hovered between consciousness and some other, quieter world. "Lydia, dear, stay with us," the mistress whispered, brushing damp curls away from her sister's forehead. "You must listen to Mrs. Penhallow. You must push." But Lydia's eyes were heavy, half-lidded, glistening like glass marbles beneath her lashes. She blinked slowly, as if waking from a particularly deep sleep, her brow furrowing in distant confusion. Her breaths came shallow, her lips parted slightly. Pain rolled through her, yet her face barely registered the intensity. Elsbeth stood at her side, supporting her back, feeling every shudder of her weakening body. The morphine had wrapped Lydia in a gentle, deceptive fog, muting the agony, yes, but also muting her resolve. The midwife, usually so calm, grew increasingly tense. "Lydia, you must push now," Mrs. Penhallow urged. "Your child is ready, but you must meet the moment." Lydia tried. Her hands tightened weakly into the sheets. Her head dropped forward, her voice barely escaping her. "I am trying. I just feel so far away." Far away, that was the truth of it. Her labor no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the drug that coated her nerves like velvet. Each contraction drifted toward her, as if from a great distance. Pain reached her as a muted echo, stripped of urgency. The instinctive drive, fierce, primal, that urged women through childbirth had been hushed into submission. Minutes bled into one another, slow and syrupy. The rhythm of the room grew warped, Elsbeth's heartbeat loud in her ears, the mistress's anxious whispers melding into the soft rustle of linens, the midwife's commands sounding muffled and hollow. "Again, Lydia." "Push," Mrs. Penhallow said firmly. Lydia inhaled. She shuddered. She pushed, but without force, without fire, without the raw determination unclouded labor demanded. Her body sagged backward once more, trembling. Elsbeth exchanged a worried glance with the mistress. "She is too weary," she whispered. "The morphine—" "I know," the mistress said, her voice breaking. "But what could we do? She was suffering so terribly." The midwife shot them both a warning look. "There isn't time for regrets. We must work with the state she is in." A contraction gripped Lydia's body. She gasped, eyes widening for a brief, fragile moment. For a heartbeat, clarity flickered through her. She reached for her sister, then the fog reclaimed her, drawing her back beneath its gentle tide. "Stay awake," the mistress pleaded. "Lydia, please stay awake for your baby." But Lydia's head lolled to the side. Tears slipped from her eyes, not from pain, but from exhaustion and fear she could not properly feel. Mrs. Penhallow grabbed a damp cloth and wiped Lydia's face, her movements brisk, her jaw tight. "This is why the physician's doses must be handled with care," she muttered under her breath, frustration bleeding through her usual composure. The morphine calms the body but steals its strength. And strength is what she needs most. Outside, the wind picked up, tapping rain against the window pane like impatient fingers. Inside, the air grew heavy with tension and the faint, lingering sweetness of morphine. Elsbeth held Lydia upright again, feeling the dead weight of her as if holding someone caught between waking and drowning. And still the midwife urged, "Push, Lydia. You must push." At last, through sheer instinct more than awareness, Lydia mustered a single, desperate effort, one that shook her entire frame. "That's it," the midwife breathed. Again. Another wave. Another attempt. Another moment, where clarity fought against the drug's dimming haze. Somewhere deep in Lydia's dazed consciousness, a flame flickered, small, fragile, but alive. She clung to that faint spark, pushing again with trembling force, her voice cracking in a soft, broken cry. Only then did Mrs. Penhallow's expression shift. "I see the head," she whispered. Relief swept through the room like a sudden breath of warm air. But as the midwife positioned herself and the final moments of labor approached, the truth hung heavy over them. Lydia's child would enter the world through a dream, not a battle, and Lydia herself hovered on the thin, perilous edge of morphine's embrace, halfway between motherhood and oblivion, trusting the vial that had softened her pain but nearly stolen her strength to survive it. When Mr. Thomas Harrow returned home that evening, the house felt unusually hushed, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. He had been delayed at the office, entangled in a series of meetings that drained the color from the day, and he entered his own foyer weary, damp from the persistent drizzle, and eager for the comfort of domestic calm. He did not expect to find his sister-in-law's labor still underway, nor did he expect the fog of morphine that clung faintly to the air like the lingering sweetness of crushed flowers. Elsbeth met him near the foot of the staircase, her apron streaked with perspiration and worry. "Sir," she whispered urgently, "they are still upstairs with Miss Lydia. She's been in labor for hours." His expression flickered from surprise to concern. "Is the midwife still with her?" "Yes, sir." "And my wife?" "With her also." He removed his gloves slowly, thoughtfully. "Very well. Prepare warm water and ask cook for broth. I'll go up." He ascended the staircase with measured steps, unaware that with each step he drew closer to choices that had already been made without him, choices softened by morphine, wrapped in good intentions, and shadowed by risk. When he stepped into the dim, lamplit bedroom, the sight before him struck a blow to his chest. Lydia lay slumped against pillows, deathly pale but breathing. The midwife worked with firm precision. The mistress knelt at her sister's side, clasping her hand with visible desperation. Thomas's first reaction was alarm. His second was something closer to awe, because Lydia, despite the strain of her long labor, was quiet, not shrieking, not writhing, not tearing the room apart with agony. Quiet. What have you given her?" he murmured, stepping closer. Mrs. Penhallow did not look up. "Morphine, sir. A small dose to ease her suffering." A small dose. Elsbeth, lingering nearby, thought of the empty vial. The mistress rose shakily from the bedside and turned to her husband. Her face was streaked with worry, but her voice carried a strange, soft relief. "She was in such pain, Thomas. She could not bear it." The midwife said the medicine would help. Mr. Harrow approached Lydia, studying her half-closed eyes, her shallow breaths, the dreamlike murmur that slipped from her lips. He placed a hand on her forehead, noting the cool dampness, the faint tremble beneath the skin. "I've never seen her so calm during anything," he said softly. "God bless modern science." Elsbeth felt her stomach twist. The mistress exhaled shakily. "It saved her, Thomas. Without it, she would have been suffering still." Mrs. Penhallow allowed herself a brief, tired nod. "The medicine keeps her body from shaking apart. Pain like hers can slow labor, even stop it." This allowed her to rest enough to continue. Thomas Harrow stepped back, his features softening with something perilously close to pride, not for Lydia, but for the remedy that had tamed her suffering. He turned as though addressing the entire room. "Then thank heaven for morphine. What a miracle it is, truly. Imagine the torment women endured before this." His voice swelled with conviction, a gentleman's confidence in progress, in innovation, in anything wrapped in the promise of science. He was a man accustomed to solutions, to order, to efficiency. Pain raw, ungoverned pain offended him. Medicine that subdued it felt like triumph. He did not see Lydia's hand, limp as fallen lace. He did not notice the midwife's subtle glances of worry. He did not hear the tiny catch in Elsbeth's breath. He saw only peace. "Look at her," he continued softly. "She rests. Surely that is mercy. If such medicines can spare women agony, then they must be celebrated." Mrs. Penhallow hesitated. "Mercy, yes, but there are risks, sir." "All things worth doing carry risks." He waved a dismissive hand, eyes fixed on Lydia's serene, drug-fogged face. "But look at the alternative. Science, medicine are gifts. What sort of fool would deny a suffering woman this comfort?" Elsbeth lowered her eyes. She had seen many such fools, only they were not fools at all. They were wary. They were wise. They were women who understood the fine line between relief and ruin. But Thomas Harrow was a wealthy Victorian gentleman. The line did not exist for him. He turned to his wife, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did right. Your sister will recover. She'll thank you for this mercy." The mistress swallowed hard. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I hope so." Outside, thunder rumbled faintly, the storm gathering strength. Inside, Lydia drifted deeper into her morphine-softened labor, her fate balanced delicately between science and surrender. Thomas Harrow stood tall, certain, untroubled. He praised the medicine. He did not yet understand its price. Dawn crept reluctantly into the Harrow household. casting a pale, washed-out light across the corridor's light that revealed the aftermath of the long, harrowing night. The rain had ceased some time before sunrise, but the dampness lingered in the air, clinging to the wallpapers, the carpets, even the linens carried hurriedly to and from the guest room. Lydia Harrow survived the birth. Her child, a small, wrinkled, fragile thing, let out its first cry just past midnight, a thin wail that pierced the fog of exhaustion hanging over the room. Relief had washed through the household like warm water, softening every tense shoulder, every clenched breath. But the relief did not last. The morning after the dose was never kind. Elsbeth stood in the doorway of the guest room now, her apron twisted nervously in her hands. Inside, Lydia lay propped up against pillows, her eyes half open yet distant, drifting, unfocused. The newborn slept in a wicker cradle nearby, wrapped tightly against the cold. The midwife had departed at dawn, her expression shadowed with fatigue and something like regret. Mrs. Harrow sat beside her sister's bed, watching Lydia with trembling hands clasped in her lap. "How do you feel?" she asked softly, hoping for strength in Lydia's voice. But Lydia's answer came delayed, thick, wrapped in a drowsy fog. "I don't know. I feel so heavy." Her voice wavered, as though reaching through water. Thomas stood near the window, arms folded, squinting at the morning light with a satisfied air. She needs rest. It was a difficult labor. Anyone would be exhausted. Elsbeth swallowed, unable to keep her eyes from Lydia's pallor. Her lips were tinged faintly blue. Her cheeks were drained of color. Sweat still glistened along her hairline. Cold now, not warm from exertion. She blinked slowly, as if each movement cost her tremendous effort. The mistress reached for her hand. "Lydia, can you drink something? Perhaps water?" Lydia's eyes drifted toward her sister, but not truly. They hovered somewhere between recognition and oblivion. "Water," she whispered. "Yes, if I can." Her hand trembled when she lifted it, not from weakness alone, but from the strange, lingering detachment that morphine often left behind, a shadow of its midnight mercy. Elsbeth quickly poured a glass and brought it forward. Lydia attempted to grasp it, but her fingers slid off the cool surface. The mistress caught the glass just before it spilled. Thomas chuckled lightly, too lightly. "She's groggy. Anyone would be after a night like that." The midwife said the medicine would linger. Elsbeth felt her pulse quicken. "Sir, it may be more than lingering." He waved her off with a dismissive gesture. "Nonsense. Painkillers work wonders. Science marches on, and we must keep pace." But as the minutes passed, even he could not ignore the signs. Lydia faded in and out of consciousness. Her breaths came shallow, uneven. Her responses grew slower, slipping into mumbled phrases that trailed off before reaching meaning. At one point, her gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the ceiling, her eyes wide with a kind of dreamy terror. "I can't wake fully," she whispered, voice quivering. "I'm trying, but I can't reach the surface." The mistress's composure finally cracked. "Thomas, look at her. This is not normal weariness." He stepped forward, frowning now, studying Lydia's face more closely. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his features, just a flicker, but enough. Elsbeth spoke softly, unable to remain silent. "Morphine does not simply soothe. It can hold the body too tightly. It can keep it from waking." Her voice trembled, but her eyes remained steady. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Then fetch the doctor, quickly." Elsbeth rushed down the corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs as she sent a boy to summon Dr. Whitcomb. She returned to the room moments later, breathless. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. The mistress stroked Lydia's hair, whispering her name over and over in an urgent, trembling chant. Thomas paced near the bed, rubbing his forehead with restless dread. Lydia lay still, too still. Her breathing was a faint ripple. Her eyelids fluttered with the rapid movement of dreams she could not escape. The newborn's soft whimpers from the cradle seemed unbearably loud in the silence that gathered around the mother. "Stay with me, Lydia," the mistress pleaded. "Please, stay awake." Hours passed before Dr. Whitcomb finally arrived, his coat carrying the familiar sweetness of ether, his expression lined with concern. He stepped into the room, took one look at Lydia, and paled. "How much was she given?" he asked sharply. The mistress's voice broke. The midwife said it would help. She was in agony. Dr. Whitcomb knelt beside the bed, examining Lydia with swift, experienced hands. His voice lowered to a grave whisper. "This is too deep. The dose was too strong. She is suspended between waking and collapse." Suspended. That was the perfect word for it. Suspended like a moth caught in amber. Suspended like a breath held too long. Suspended in the fragile space between life and something colder. The morning after the dose had revealed the truth no one wished to face. Relief had been purchased, but with a debt no one yet knew how to pay. Pain has a way of waiting. It lurks at the edges of comfort, patient as a shadow, biding its time until the medicine fades and the body wakes to the truth it had only borrowed reprieve from. In Victorian England, few understood this cruel rhythm better than the women who relied on morphine and laudanum, whose moments of stillness were purchased on fragile credit, soon to be reclaimed with interest. And in the Harrow household, the debt was coming due. Lydia remained bedridden for several days after the difficult birth. Though she recovered slowly, the haunted look in her eyes, half lucid, half dreaming, betrayed how deeply the morphine had wounded itself through her system. By the 4th day, she could sit upright with assistance. On the 5th, she could hold her child without trembling. But on the 6th morning, long before the household stirred, a sharp cry shattered the dawn silence. Elsbeth rushed to the guest room. The mistress, already fully awake, stood at the bedside, her hands pressed to her ears. Thomas was attempting to calm his sister by speaking in hurried, low tones. But Lydia's cries rose above everything, piercing, frantic, unlike anything they had yet heard from her. "I can't," she gasped, curling inward as if struck. "I can't bear it. My head, my bones, everything aches." Her words tangled into sobs, her breath coming in shallow, frantic bursts. Elsbeth hurried to her side. "Miss Lydia, where does it hurt? Tell me." "Everywhere," Lydia whispered hoarsely. "Everywhere. It burns, as if something is clawing under my skin." Her voice dissolved into choking silence as she doubled forward, clutching her stomach. The pain of childbirth had been blunted by morphine, but the pain now, the pain of withdrawal, arrived raw and vicious, sharper than anything she had felt in labor. The mistress knelt beside her, tears spilling freely. "Is it the birth? Is it fever?" "No," Lydia rasped. "It feels wrong. It feels like falling." Sweat slicked her brow despite the chill morning air. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. When Thomas touched her shoulder, she recoiled as though his hand were made of fire. Elsbeth's heart sank. This was no fever. This was no remnant of childbirth. This was the body reclaiming what morphine had briefly stolen from it, the agony, the exhaustion, the unfiltered reality. And it was returning twice as sharp. Dr. Whitcomb arrived within the hour, sweeping into the room with his usual air of authority, though the look he cast upon Lydia held unmistakable gravity. "She is in the grip of intensifying pain," he murmured after a brief examination. "It often follows the use of strong opiates." The mistress's tear-streaked face lifted in disbelief. "But the medicine was meant to help her." "And it did," he said softly. "But such help is temporary. The body grows used to comfort far quicker than one expects." Thomas stiffened. "She cannot suffer like this. There must be something you can give her." At this, Dr. Whitcomb hesitated. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Another dose might ease her pain, but it would begin the cycle anew, with each relief inviting an even sharper return when it fades. The mistress gasped. So she must endure this? No remedy at all? There are always remedies, the doctor replied, his eyes flicking toward his case, but each one must be weighed against its consequence. Lydia cried out again, a sound that hollowed the room, that made even the doctor flinch. Thomas's resolve wavered. She cannot bear such agony. And yet, Dr. Whitcomb whispered, many must. Elspeth could barely watch. Lydia clutched the sheets so tightly her knuckles whitened. Every part of her shook, not from weakness, but from a desperate, feral attempt to break free from the pain racking her body. This was the cruel truth Victorian medicine rarely acknowledged, that every gentle dose carried a hidden price, that every night of peace collected its due in daylight, and the due was steep. By midday, Lydia's pain escalated into restless delirium. She thrashed, begged, wept, then collapsed into shivering silence, only to repeat the cycle minutes later. The newborn's cries were drowned out by Lydia's own. The entire house bent around her suffering. At last, Thomas turned to Dr. Whitcomb, defeat in his eyes. Give her something, anything, please. The mistress nodded through tears. She will break if this continues. Dr. Whitcomb's jaw tightened. He reached for his case with reluctant hands. Elspeth felt the room's breath hitch. The syringe glimmered faintly. The vial of morphine hummed in the air like temptation itself. Lydia whimpered, reaching blindly toward the doctor. He hesitated, then drew the dose. Elspeth looked away, grief hollowing her chest. The needle slipped beneath Lydia's skin. Relief flooded her features. Her trembling eased. Her cries softened to small, exhausted sobs. Within minutes, her breathing steadied, her eyes closing as morphine wrapped her once more in its treacherous embrace. Silence fell over the room. Heavy, merciful, terrifying. Thomas let out a breath of shaky gratitude. The mistress held her sister's hand, whispering a quiet prayer of thanks. Only Elspeth saw the truth. The cycle restarting, the quiet erosion of strength, the inevitable return of pain, sharper still, waiting patiently in the wings. Because relief, true Victorian relief, was never free. It always returned with claws. Dr. Whitcomb returned to the Harrow household 3 days after Lydia's relapse, summoned not by urgent messenger this time, but by quiet insistence. Pain had settled into Lydia's body like an uninvited tenant, refusing to leave, refusing even to negotiate. The morphine had granted her temporary reprieve, but when its warmth receded, the shadows it left behind grew darker, sharper, more cunning. Something had to be done, Thomas insisted. His wife echoed him. Even Lydia, pale and trembling beneath her blankets, begged for the pangs to stop. And so, when the doctor arrived on that grey afternoon, the household looked to him as they once looked to priests, for answers, for mercy, for salvation that didn't require suffering. He stepped inside, brushing rain from his coat, the faint scent of ether drifting upward as always, a perfume that now felt sinister to Elspeth, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. His leather bag swung gently at his side, heavy with its instruments and bottles, each one promising help at a price no one yet dared calculate. "How is she?" he asked softly as he climbed the stairs. Elspeth hesitated. "Restless, sir. The pain comes and goes, but when it comes, it is terrible." He nodded, unsurprised. Such is the nature of strong medicines. They ease pain but do not banish it. Once the body tastes such relief, it resists returning to its former suffering. They reached the guest room. Lydia lay propped against pillows, her hair damp, her cheeks hollowed into fragile shadows. Her eyes glowed with desperation, not the wildness of agony, but the fragile trembling of someone afraid of its return. "Doctor," she whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers. "It's happening again. Please, don't let it." Mrs. Harrow sat beside her, clasping her hand. Thomas stood rigidly at the foot of the bed, his impatience wrapped neatly beneath a gentleman's composure. Dr. Whitcomb approached with calm gravity. He placed a cool hand on Lydia's forehead, then turned to lift her wrist. Her pulse fluttered beneath his fingers, a frantic, bird-like beating. "She is weakened," he murmured. The last dose dulled her systems more deeply than expected. Elsbeth's breath hitched. That was not what they wanted to hear. "But she cannot endure the pain," Thomas insisted. "You saw it yourself. It nearly drove her mad." "I know," the doctor replied, rubbing his temple. "Morphine must be handled with care. But sometimes—" He paused, choosing his words with deliberate, practiced caution. "Sometimes a slightly stronger measure is required to stabilize the system." Elsbeth felt a cold shiver run through her. The mistress, pale with worry, leaned forward. "Stronger? But is it safe?" "Safer than allowing her to writhe in agony until exhaustion stops her heart," he said gently. "Pain of this severity can be as dangerous as the remedy." Lydia whimpered a small, broken sound that tore through the room like a blade. She clutched her abdomen, her fingers digging into the blankets. "Please," she gasped. "Doctor, please, I can't do it again." That was all it took. Dr. Whitcomb opened his leather bag. The room seemed to hold its breath. He withdrew a bottle, its glass darker than the usual amber, its label more discreet. He picked up the syringe, inspecting it closely, before drawing the morphine from the vial. The liquid shimmered as it filled the glass barrel. "This measure," he said quietly, "should hold her longer. It will carry her through the next day with minimal suffering." Elsbeth's heart pounded. She had seen this before. A patient grows tolerant, the doctor increases the measure, the relief deepens, and so does the dependence. But she said nothing. She could say nothing. Dr. Whitcomb approached the bedside, his movements soft, deliberate, practiced. He touched Lydia's arm. "Deep breath, my dear." She obeyed, tears slipping down her cheeks. The needle pierced her skin. Her breath caught. Then slowly, beautifully, terrifyingly, her features softened. Her shoulders eased. Her fingers loosened their grip on the sheets. The trembling left her body like smoke, leaving a dying flame. For the first time in days, her pain dissolved. She sighed a long, fragile exhale and slumped back into the pillows, her gaze drifting toward the window where the rain trickled quietly down the glass. "There now," the doctor whispered. "Let the medicine carry you." Thomas closed his eyes with relief. The mistress pressed a hand to her mouth, trembling with gratitude. Only Elsbeth watched Lydia's face with a tightening dread. This was not peace. This was surrender. The doctor cleaned the syringe, placed it back into the velvet-lined case, and snapped the latch shut. "Monitor her breathing," he instructed. "If she grows too still, send for me immediately." He gathered his bag and departed, descending the stairs with calm certainty. Behind him, the household exhaled, but Elsbeth remained frozen beside the bed. She watched Lydia, her lips parted slightly, her breaths slow and faint. Too faint. Each exhale seemed thinner than the last, and all she could think was a stronger dose, a deeper silence, a slow, quiet slipping. Victorian medicine had a way of giving comfort with one hand while stealing something essential with the other. And now that the measure had increased, Elsbeth feared the cost would rise with it. There comes a moment in every household touched by the darker side of Victorian medicine when the truth begins to whisper quietly at first, like a draft beneath a closed door. It does not announce itself with theatrics or sudden catastrophe. Instead, it creeps, it softens, it dims, and then, before anyone can say the words aloud, the body begins to yield. In the Harrow home, that moment came 2 days after Dr. Whitcomb increased Lydia's morphine dose. Lydia had slept across most of those 2 days, sinking into deep, unbroken stretches of quiet at first welcomed, then feared. When she did stir, it was with the disorientation of someone waking from an ocean's depths, her mind floating somewhere behind her eyes. On the morning of the third day, the house awoke to a silence that felt unnatural. Elspeth entered the guest room with a bowl of broth and a cloth folded neatly across her arm. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a muted strip of winter light that cast the room in a grey blur. Lydia lay on her side, her breaths shallow but even. The mistress sat nearby, her sewing abandoned in her lap, anxiety etched into every line of her posture. "She has not woken properly since last evening," the mistress whispered, her voice thin with worry. "She opens her eyes, but she does not seem to see." Elspeth set the tray down gently. "Has she eaten anything?" She tried to sip water, but it dribbled down her chin. The mistress closed her eyes in pained recollection. She apologized, Elspeth, as though it were her fault. Elspeth approached the bedside. Lydia's skin held a pale sheen, not the pallor of childbirth, but the translucent weakness of someone fading. Her lips were dry. A faint tremor shivered along her jaw, though her limbs were still as stone. "Miss Lydia?" Elspeth called softly. Lydia's eyelids fluttered open. For a moment, her gaze roamed the room in a fogged, wandering daze. Her eyes, usually soft and warm, looked distant, glassy, as though reflecting a world she could no longer grasp. "Are you in pain?" Elspeth asked, leaning closer. Lydia opened her mouth to speak, but the words came out slurred. "No pain, just heavy. My arms feel like sand." The mistress let out a quiet sob. "This cannot be right. She is too still." But Thomas, who entered the room at that moment, dismissed their fear. "She is resting, that is all." The doctor said the stronger dose would help her recover. Elspeth turned toward him, her voice trembling despite her restraint. "Sir, there are signs her body is growing too weak. She can barely lift her head." "Nonsense," he said, though his eyes flicked uneasily toward his sister. "The medicine is strong. It must run its course." But Lydia did not appear to be merely resting. Her breathing was the first sign, soft, shallow, separated by long pauses that made the mistress lean forward in alarm each time. Lydia's chest stilled too long. The second sign was her inability to stay awake. Even when spoken to, even when touched gently on the arm, she slipped back into unconsciousness within moments, as though gravity itself were pulling her downward. The third sign, subtle yet unmistakable, was the way her limbs seemed to lose their strength entirely. When Elspeth lifted her hand, it drooped like a silk glove. When she tried to reposition Lydia in the bed, her body folded limply, without the slightest resistance. "She cannot support her own weight," Elspeth whispered. Thomas frowned, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Morphine softens the muscles. Everyone knows that." "Not like this," the mistress murmured. The fourth sign arrived shortly after, a faint bluish tint creeping into Lydia's fingertips, as though the blood struggled to reach them. Her breaths grew shallower still, barely lifting the covers. "Thomas," the mistress said suddenly, her voice sharp with fear. "Send for the doctor. Now." He hesitated only a moment before nodding, his brow furrowed in dawning alarm. "Very well. I'll send someone." As he left the room, the mistress clutched Lydia's hand, whispering her name like a prayer that might anchor her to the waking world. But Lydia remained half-conscious, drifting in and out, her eyes rolling faintly beneath her lids. Elspeth had seen bodies yield before poor mothers in the slums, trembling men in workhouses, patients whose strength dwindled beneath the weight of laudanum or disappointment or grief. She recognized the signs. The body yielded quietly. It yielded politely. It yielded as though apologizing for slipping away. Minutes stretched into long, torturous hours as they waited for Dr. Whitcomb. The winter light dimmed, shadows pooling in the corners of the room like gathering storm clouds. Lydia's breaths remained shallow. Her fingers remained cold. Her voice faded to silence. And in that silence the truth whispered clearly at last. The stronger dose had been too strong, and the body, fragile, mortal, exhausted, was beginning to let go. In Victorian London, news travelled faster than any carriage. It seeped through walls, drifted beneath doors, and spread from one household to the next, like a cold draught slipping through a cracked window. Illness, scandal, misfortune, none remained private for long, and when a respectable family such as the Harrows found themselves cloaked in sudden mystery, the neighbours began to whisper with hungry fascination. The first whispers began innocently enough. Mrs. Cartwright, the grocer's wife, noticed that the Harrow cook purchased broth, barley water, and lavender bundles, instead of the usual assortment of hearty ingredients. Then Mrs. Finch, who lived opposite, remarked that the curtains in the guest room remained half-drawn all hours of the day. And once the midwife's hurried visits began, each arrival more brusque, each departure more sombre speculation took on a life of its own. "Something is amiss at number 14, murmured Mrs. Cartwright, as she arranged apples in perfect rows. "I've not heard the infant's cry since the day of the birth." "Nor have I," Mrs. Finch replied, lowering her voice dramatically. "And I've counted 3 visits from that Dr. Whitcomb. 3 in as many days. Mark my words, something is wrong with the mother." The whispers grew like mould in damp corners, quietly at first, then rapidly, with curious tendrils reaching into every parlour and drawing room along the street. Inside the Harrow home, the atmosphere had thickened into something heavy and unspoken. Lydia's condition had deteriorated since the stronger dose. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her breaths shallow and uneven. Though the doctor insisted she might yet recover, his tone lacked conviction. The mistress sat at Lydia's bedside day and night, her eyes swollen from weeping, her hands icy from holding Lydia's limp fingers. Elspeth did all she could, adjusted pillows, moistened lips, whispered gentle encouragements, but nothing stirred Lydia properly awake, nothing coaxed the strength back into her limbs. And as the household retreated into anxious silence, the outside world intensified its curiosity. The maid from next door knocked under the guise of returning a borrowed broom, though her eyes scanned the hallway with poorly hidden intrigue. A seamstress delivering mended garments lingered on the doorstep longer than necessary, craning her neck for a glimpse into the dim interior. Even the lamplighter paused one evening, lifting his gaze toward the darkened windows of the guest room as though expecting an apparition to appear. "People have begun talking," Elspeth whispered to the mistress one evening as she adjusted the lampshade to soften the glow. "Mrs. Finch asked if you'd be receiving callers again soon." She seemed eager for information. The mistress's shoulders stiffened. "Let them talk. Our concerns lie within this room, not outside it." But the words lacked strength. Her voice trembled as she stroked Lydia's hair. "What if they think ill of us?" she murmured after a moment. "What if they imagine we've done something wrong?" Elspeth hesitated before speaking. "People imagine anything when they do not know the truth." The mistress stared into the shadows gathering along the corner of the room. "And what truth is there to give them, Elspeth? That my sister is drifting between waking and death because of a medicine I trusted? Because of a remedy I welcomed into this household?" She swallowed a sob. No one must know. But secrets, especially in Victorian London, were like damp, impossible to contain. That afternoon, as Lydia slept with shallow breaths and the mistress sat stitching uselessly to distract her shaking hands, a muffled conversation echoed through the foyer. Thomas Harrow was speaking quietly to Mr. Grayson, a business acquaintance who had stopped by unexpectedly. Though they spoke in low tones, their voices carried just enough for Elspeth to hear as she descended the stairs with fresh linens. "A difficult time," Thomas murmured. "I've heard as much," Grayson replied, leaning closer as though savouring the intrigue. One cannot help noticing the doctor's frequent arrivals. Is it true the young mother is gravely ill? Thomas stiffened. She is recovering. From what ailment? Thomas hesitated just long enough for Grayson to smile knowingly. You need not say it, Grayson whispered. Word travels quickly. Some speculate it was complications of the tonic. Others suspect the midwife gave her too heavy a hand with the laudanum. Thomas's face darkened. People should curb their imaginations. But Grayson merely tipped his hat. In this city, never. After he left, Thomas remained in the foyer for several moments, motionless, jaw clenched. Elspeth passed him silently, but she felt the tension radiating from him like heat from a smouldering ember. The neighbours were talking, and their whispers curled around the entire household like creeping ivy. That evening, as the lamps flickered against the fog seeping through the windows, Lydia stirred faintly. A soft groan escaped her lips, weak, fragile, but real. The mistress rushed to her side. "Lydia? Can you hear me?" Lydia's eyelids fluttered, but her gaze remained unfocused. Her lips parted, forming a faint whisper. Too heavy. Everything is too heavy. Then her eyes closed again. Her few words did nothing to calm the household. If anything, they deepened the dread. For the body was yielding, and the outside world was circling, whispering, speculating, sensing the unravelling behind the closed curtains of number 14 Grafton Street. And in Victorian London, whispers had a way of becoming truths, long before the truth itself was known. Panic seldom entered Victorian households with loud proclamations. It arrived softly like a draught under the parlour door or an unexpected chill brushing across the back of one's neck. It crept into the corners first, then into glances exchanged between family members, into trembling hands and unspoken fears. And before anyone dared name it, panic had already settled itself comfortably within the walls. By the time the neighbours' whispers reached a brisk roar beyond the gates of number 14 Grafton Street, a quieter, far more dangerous panic bloomed inside the Harrow home. Lydia remained in a fragile half-state, neither awake nor truly asleep. Her breaths came in shallow, inconsistent patterns that made the mistress lean forward every few minutes, holding her own breath until Lydia exhaled. Her eyelids fluttered like dying moth wings. Her skin had taken on a thin, almost translucent quality, as though the light passed through rather than across it. Elspeth tended to her constantly. She dabbed Lydia's lips with damp cloths, repositioned her body to prevent stiffness, and whispered reassurances even though she knew Lydia was drifting too far into the morphine fog to hear them. But it was not only Lydia who was fading. The entire household felt suspended, caught in a weary, trembling stillness. At breakfast that morning, the mistress stared into her untouched tea. The steam curled upward in delicate spirals, dissolving before it reached her face. Her hands remained clasped tightly, knuckles pale. Thomas sat across from her, reading the newspaper without truly seeing it. Each turning page sounded louder than it should, harsh against the quiet room. "It says here," he muttered absently, "that a woman in Bloomsbury died after complications with her physician's tonic. Nonsense, of course. Sensationalist rubbish." But his voice lacked conviction. The mistress lifted her gaze, eyes swollen from sleepless nights. "Thomas, do you believe Lydia will recover?" He froze, folded the newspaper, set it aside. "I believe," he said slowly, "that the doctor is doing all that can be done." "That is not what I asked." He hesitated. "I don't know." A tiny sound escaped the mistress, something between a sigh and a sob. Elspeth, clearing dishes nearby, felt the air shift with unspoken dread. Later that afternoon, as rain began tapping gently against the window panes, a sudden thump echoed from the upper hallway. The mistress gasped and rushed upstairs, Elspeth close behind her. The noise had come from Lydia's room. Inside, they found her halfway out of bed, her limp body draped precariously toward the edge. Her quilts had twisted around her legs. Her eyes were half open but unseeing, moving with slow, swirling confusion. "Lydia!" the mistress cried, hurrying to lift her upright. Lydia moaned faintly, her head slumping against her sister's shoulder. Elsbeth supported her from the other side. "Easy now. You mustn't move like that." I heard crying," Lydia whispered weakly. "I thought the baby," but her voice trailed off. Her arms hung loosely, as though she were a marionette whose strings had slackened. Her breath trembled each time she inhaled. The mistress held her close. "You nearly fell, Lydia. You must stay still." Lydia blinked slowly. Sweat gathered along her brow. "Everything feels tilted. The walls, the floor. I can't find my balance." Elsbeth said nothing because she understood. It was the morphine unraveling her senses, clouding her perception, weakening her body further each day. They helped Lydia lie back down, though her limbs resisted only faintly, like softened wax. She murmured incoherently as they adjusted her pillows, drifting between worlds again. The mistress knelt by the bedside, trembling. "This cannot continue. Thomas must do something." Elsbeth did not remind her that Thomas had already done something. He had allowed the stronger dose. Instead, she placed a reassuring hand on the mistress's shoulder. "We have sent for Dr. Whitcomb again," she whispered. "He will know what to do." But even as she said the words, a cold certainty settled beneath her ribs. Dr. Whitcomb was part of the problem, not the solution. Downstairs, Thomas paced the drawing room, his agitation impossible to conceal. When the mistress finally descended, he turned toward her with the wild-eyed look of someone desperately trying to salvage control. "She nearly fell," the mistress said. "We found her almost on the floor." Thomas exhaled sharply. "She must be watched constantly then." "Thomas, this is beyond watching," he swallowed. "Are you saying—" "I am saying she is slipping." The words seemed to echo through the quiet room. "Slipping," the mistress continued, her voice trembling. Her breathing slows, her strength fades. She barely wakes. "This is not recovery. It is something else entirely." Thomas raked a hand through his hair. "We cannot tell anyone. If the neighbors learn—" "Thomas!" the mistress's voice cracked. "Your sister is dying." Silence. Heavy as iron. Elsbeth, entering quietly with fresh towels, paused at the threshold, her heart pounding. For the first time, the truth lay naked in the room. Not whispered, not implied, not softened, spoken. Upstairs, Lydia stirred faintly, murmuring words no one could understand. The baby's soft cooing from the adjoining nursery floated faintly through the corridor, an eerie counterpoint to Lydia's shallow breaths. The panic that had crept quietly into the Harrow household finally settled, fully coiled around the family like mist. And in Victorian England, once panic took hold, it rarely released its grip. There was a time when the Harrow medicine chest held only the usual contents of a respectable Victorian home: earthenware jars of camphor, lavender salve, a tin of mustard plaster, a bottle of cod liver oil. Simple things, proper things, remedies meant to soothe common ailments, not rewrite the very rhythms of a life. But those days were gone. Now the chest, once tucked discreetly into a corner cabinet, had been moved to the guest room closer to Lydia, and with each passing day it seemed to grow heavier, fuller, more complex. Its wooden frame stood open more often than not, its shelves littered with vials, syringes, powders, and tinctures whose names held the soft menace of promises too easily believed. Elsbeth dreaded it. The mistress depended on it. Thomas trusted it because he trusted the doctor. And Lydia, poor Lydia, had become bound to it in ways none of them had foreseen. That morning, after another restless night of shallow breaths and fragmented murmurs, the mistress called Elsbeth to the bedside. "We must organize the medicines," she whispered. as if speaking too loudly would disturb the fragile air around Lydia. "Dr. Whitcomb will need to know precisely what has been given, and when." Elspeth nodded, though apprehension coiled low in her stomach. She carried the chest to the table beside the window, its hinges creaking softly like a weary sigh. When she opened it fully, the sight made her breath catch. Dark bottles with golden script, clear glass vials tinged with faint amber, paper packets folded with chemist's care, a velvet pouch protecting the syringe case, a small jar of chloroform, tightly corked, a tonic spoon, its bowl stained rose pink, and tucked beneath it all, the stronger morphine vial, half empty now, its contents clinging to the glass like a quiet curse. The mistress hovered nearby, her eyes, haunted. "Lay everything out. I need to see what we've used, and what we have left." As Elspeth arranged the bottles on the table, sunlight filtered through the translucent liquids, casting pale ribbons of color across the wood. The effect was strangely beautiful, and deeply unsettling. "Look at it," the mistress whispered. "You'd think it were a collection of perfumes." Elspeth swallowed. "All poisons, ma'am." The mistress flinched. "I didn't mean—" Elspeth began. "No," the mistress interrupted softly. "You are right. These bottles, I no longer know which are meant to heal and which merely delay suffering." Her hands trembled as she picked up one bottle, the laudanum Lydia used after the birth, its ribbon frayed from frequent untying. She held it gently, almost reverently. "I offered this to her," she whispered. "I placed it in her hands. I believed I was helping." "You did what anyone would have done," Elspeth said. "You trusted the doctor." But the mistress's eyes filled with tears. "If she dies, will it be mercy that failed her? Or my own foolishness?" Elspeth did not answer. She could not. Thomas entered the room moments later, his expression grim. "The physician will be here within the hour," he announced. "He says he needs to assess the medicines directly." The mistress stiffened. "Assess? What does that mean?" "That he suspects something," Thomas muttered. "Perhaps one dose was too strong, or perhaps the midwife misjudged." Elspeth felt a cold prickle crawl up her arms. "So he believes the fault lies with someone else?" the mistress asked bitterly. "He says Lydia's constitution is delicate," Thomas replied defensively. "He says some bodies react unpredictably." "Thomas," the mistress whispered, "look at her." All three turned toward the bed. Lydia lay motionless, her breathing a faint rise and fall beneath the blankets. Her child slept in the cradle beside her, tiny fists curled near its face, unaware of the turmoil around it. She looked peaceful, too peaceful, as if carved from wax. That was the most terrifying part. Elspeth returned to the table, hands trembling as she lifted another bottle, the women's tonic with its rosy tint. She set it beside the morphine, beside the chloroform, beside the powder packets. "One would think," she whispered softly, "that you could build an entire life from bottles like these." The mistress closed her eyes. "We did build a life from them, a life of ease, of quieting pain, of softening hardships. And now—" she opened her eyes again, tears shining on her lashes. "Now I am afraid these bottles will take her from us entirely." Thomas exhaled sharply, running a hand across his face. "We must trust the doctor. He knows what he's doing." But Elspeth saw it in his eyes, the doubt creeping in, thin as a thread but growing with each passing hour. By the time the clock chimed noon, the medicine chest lay fully emptied across the table, every vial, every dose, every instrument displayed like relics in a shrine to misplaced faith. For years, the Harrows had believed medicine was progress, something to ease suffering, to civilize pain, to lift women out of the agonies generations had endured. But now, standing before the table crowded with shiny glass and deceptive promises, Elspeth saw the truth plainly. The medicine chest had become not a symbol of healing, but the altar upon which Lydia's strength had been quietly sacrificed. And the physician, soon to arrive, would find himself facing not just a patient slipping away, but a household beginning to understand the cost of the comfort they once praised. Infants do not understand illness. They do not comprehend drifting consciousness, dangerous medicines, or the hush that settles over a household when death begins to brush its cold fingers against someone beloved. But they understand absence. They feel it instinctively, an ache, not unlike hunger, a loneliness deeper than language. And Lydia's child, barely a week old and fragile as a moth's wing, felt that absence in every breath. The morning Lydia slipped further into her morphine-softened days, the infant began to cry. At first it was a small, fretful sound, thin as thread, easily soothed with rocking and gentle humming. Elsbeth tended to the child while the mistress sat vigil beside Lydia, her eyes glued to her sister's shallow breaths. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the infant's cries grew sharper, piercing, dissonant, desperate. The wails carried through the hallway, slipping beneath doorways and echoing faintly down the staircase. They did not stop. They did not pause for rest. They rose and fell like the tide, loud, mournful, accusing. Elsbeth clutched the tiny bundle to her chest, bouncing lightly, whispering softly, "Shh, now. Hush, sweeting. Your mamma is resting." But the child only cried harder, as though the very sound of mamma made her grief swell. Upstairs, Lydia stirred faintly, her head rolling to one side, lips parting in a weak murmur. Her eyelids fluttered, but did not open. Her fingers twitched toward the sound, trembling as they lifted an inch, then fell lifelessly back onto the coverlet. "She hears the baby," the mistress whispered, her voice breaking. "She wants to wake. She wants to, but she cannot." Elsbeth felt tears prick her eyes. "Shall I bring the child to her?" The mistress hesitated, fearful Lydia would not react at all, then nodded. Elsbeth returned moments later, with the infant wrapped in a soft white blanket edged with embroidered violets. The cries echoed across the room, filling it with a sound that felt too large for such a small body. The mistress leaned over her sister. "Lydia? Lydia, look, your daughter needs you." She pressed the baby gently into Lydia's limp arms. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered behind Lydia's half-closed eyes. Recognition, pain, love. A primal spark beneath the morphine haze. Her lips moved. A faint breath escaped. "My baby." The child quieted for the briefest heartbeat, as though sensing her mother's presence, but then resumed crying harder than before, her tiny fists trembling against Lydia's gown. Lydia tried God. She tried to lift her arm, to cradle the baby properly, to hush her with the warmth only a mother could give. But her body refused her. Her arm shook violently, then fell. Her head slumped sideways. Her breath quickened in shallow, panicked bursts. Tears trickled down her temples, silent tears, helpless tears. She was awake enough to understand she could not wake, conscious enough to feel her child's need, and too drugged, too weakened, too near collapse to answer that need. Elsbeth gently lifted the infant again, pressing the baby close to her own shoulder. "Shh, precious one. Your mama is fighting." The mistress covered her mouth, trembling. "This isn't right. A mother should hold her child. She should comfort her, not lie here, helpless." Thomas stood in the doorway, pale, shaken. He stared at the scene with hollow eyes, as though witnessing something both sacred and unbearable. "This is the medicine's doing," the mistress whispered. "It has stolen her strength, her mind, her motherhood." Thomas swallowed hard. "The doctor said—" "I don't care what he said," she cried, her voice cracking. "Look at her, Thomas. Look at your sister." Lydia lay motionless, tears still slipping down her cheeks. The child sobbed against Elsbeth's shoulder, and in that moment, the distance between mother and child, the impossible, drug-induced gulf, felt like the cruelest wound the household had yet endured. Hours passed. The baby eventually tired herself into hiccuping whimpers, then into restless sleep. Elsbeth laid her gently in the cradle, smoothing a hand over her tiny chest. But even in sleep, the child's breaths hitched with the memory of crying. The mistress sat at the bedside, holding Lydia's limp hand. "She wants to be a mother," she whispered. "She fought through that terrible labor. She endured agony. And now she cannot even hold her child." Elsbeth placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She will wait properly, ma'am. She must." But inside, she felt a creeping dread. That Lydia might never be fully present again. That morphine had stolen more than consciousness. That the severed bond might never fully mend. Outside, the neighbors whispered about illness, scandal, misfortune. Inside, the Harrow home held a quieter tragedy. A newborn crying for a mother half awake. And a mother fighting to reach her child through a fog thick as grief. In Victorian England, medicine was praised for easing pain. But no doctor's vial, no tonic spoon could heal the silent ache of a child desperate for a mother lost somewhere inside the haze. There comes a moment in every household, touched by quiet tragedy, when a single object once familiar, once harmless, becomes unbearable to look upon. For the mistress of the Harrow home, that object was a small rose-tinted bottle on the corner of the table, the women's tonic, the one she had taken herself in restless nights, the one she had offered Lydia without hesitation, the one she now feared. It sat beneath the window where the light diffused into a soft haze, the glass shimmering like something precious. But in its shimmer, the mistress saw only accusation. Each time she passed the table, her eyes darted toward it. Each time Lydia slipped deeper into her drug-softened sleep, her guilt tightened like a corset drawn one notch too far. By morning, she could not look at it without trembling. Elsbeth found her in the guest room long before the household had woken, sitting rigidly beside Lydia's bed. Lydia lay pale and unmoving except for her shallow breaths, each inhale a fragile promise, each exhale a fear. "Ma'am?" Elsbeth whispered. The mistress did not lift her gaze. She stared at her sister's face, at the hollowness under her eyes, at the slight bluish tint beneath her nails. "Elsbeth," she said softly, "bring me the tonic." Elsbeth froze. "Ma'am?" "Bring it," the mistress repeated, but her voice wavered. Elsbeth moved toward the table, toward the rose-colored bottle glinting faintly in the early light. Her fingers brushed its smooth surface, and she hesitated. "Ma'am, forgive me, but this will not help her." The mistress finally turned her head. Her expression was haunted, exhausted, her skin drawn tight by sleeplessness. "I know," she whispered. "I know it will not help her." Then, after a long pause, her voice cracked. "It is not for her." Elsbeth's heart sank. She crossed the room slowly and placed the tonic in the mistress's trembling hands. The bottle, small as it was, seemed almost heavy as she accepted it. She ran her thumb along the delicate script on the label, the letters blurring through her unshed tears. "I took this before," she murmured. "I took it on nights when Thomas was away or Lydia was ill, nights when the house felt too large, the hours too quiet. It made everything softer." Elsbeth said nothing. The mistress swallowed. "But I never realized how that softness becomes something else. Something that reaches for you when you are weak. Something that hushes you when you should be awake." She closed her eyes, clutching the bottle to her chest. "I gave this to my sister," she whispered. I placed ease into her hands, ease that led her here. Her free hand moved to Lydia's limp fingers, squeezing them gently, not expecting a return squeeze, only hoping. Elsbeth knelt beside her. "Ma'am, no mother, no sister, no wife should bear such guilt alone." The midwife chose the dose. The doctor increased the measure. "They are responsible." The mistress shook her head. But I trusted them. I trusted all these bottles. I believed in the comfort they promised. She looked down at the tonic, her voice breaking into a whisper soaked with sorrow. I believed too easily. Later that afternoon, when Thomas stepped into the room, he found his wife sitting with the tonic resting in her lap. She did not look up. Lydia lay motionless. The baby slept in the adjoining nursery, exhausted from long hours of crying. Thomas's brow creased. "Why is that thing out?" The mistress spoke without lifting her gaze. "Because I needed to look at it." "Look at it?" "It has taken enough from us in silence," she murmured. "I will not hide it any more." Thomas stiffened. "It is only a tonic, not poison." At this, something fragile inside the mistress snapped. "Then why," she whispered, her voice trembling like thin glass, "why is my sister drifting further away each day? Why can she not wake properly? Why can she not hold her own child?" Thomas opened his mouth but found no answer. The mistress tightened her grip on the bottle. "You say we must trust the doctor. You say we must trust progress, trust science. But Thomas' science has placed her on the edge of death." Thomas paled. He stepped toward her, reaching to take the bottle, but she recoiled. "No," she said, with a quiet strength that startled even herself. "I see now what the medicine chest truly is." Thomas stared, unsure whether to argue or comfort her. Elsbeth, standing near the door, watched silently. She had known the mistress since girlhood, had dressed her hair and prepared her tea, and seen her through illness and celebration. But she had never seen her like this, frightened, resolute, and haunted all at once. The mistress set the tonic on the table with trembling hands. "I cannot change what has happened," she said softly, "but I can refuse this." Her eyes shone with a fierce, desperate clarity. "No more bottles, not for her, not for me." Thomas looked at her in disbelief. "Are you saying—" "I am saying," she whispered, "that the medicine I once trusted has become the very thing I fear most." The rose-tinted bottle stood on the table in silence, a relic of comfort, a symbol of regret, a shrine to choices made in good faith, yet leading toward ruin. And as the light faded from the room, the mistress's hand hovered over the bottle for a long, trembling moment before she pulled away, leaving it untouched. In Victorian England, many women surrendered their pain to tonics, but for the mistress of the Harrow home, the cost had finally revealed itself, and she could no longer deny it. Mrs. Penhallow did not speak loudly. Her voice was never raised. Years of guiding women through the raw and intimate ordeal of childbirth had taught her the value of soft tones and measured words. Yet even her careful whispers carried weight, especially when they cut through the thick, perfumed fog of the Harrow household, where fear, guilt, and morphine hung in equal measure. The morning began with drizzle slipping along the window panes, each droplet catching the muted sunlight like a small, suspended jewel. Lydia remained in her half-conscious state, her breaths shallow, her eyelids fluttering, the faintest tremor rippling through her limbs. The mistress hovered at her side, hand clutched tightly around Lydia's, as though sheer will could anchor her to life. Mrs. Penhallow had been summoned by urgent note. Her eyes, usually calm and measured, bore lines of fatigue etched deeply by long hours of care, by nights spent watching bodies drift toward collapse beneath the weight of medicine. "Young lady," the midwife murmured as she stepped lightly into the guest room, "she is weaker than I expected." The mistress looked up sharply. "I know," she whispered. "What do you advise?" Mrs. Penhallow drew near, placing a gentle hand on Lydia's wrist, feeling the fragile pulse, the subtle tremor beneath the skin. Too much morphine has dulled her strength. And the tonic, the powders they make, the pain bearable, but take her awareness with them. It is not safe to continue at the same measure. The mistress's lips parted in faint protest. "But what choice do we have? She suffers. She cries for her child." "And she cannot sustain herself," Mrs. Penhallow replied softly, her voice like a gentle bell ringing through the thickened air. "Every dose prolongs her suffering in silence. Her body yields more with each administration. The medicine becomes the captor, not the release." Elsbeth, standing quietly at the door, clenched her hands tightly. She had seen it before. Patients who could not awaken fully, mothers whose eyes reflected fear and confusion, even as the midwife's treatments dulled their agony. She had hoped the Harrow household would be spared, but now the truth was clear. The mistress lowered her gaze. I trusted it all," she whispered. "I believed it would ease her pain, make her labor gentle, make her whole again." "And it did," the midwife said softly. "In part, but it also steals what is most necessary, her strength, her awareness, her presence for the child she bore. You must see it as it is, a delicate balance, one that has now been tipped." The mistress shivered, her hand tightening around Lydia's. "Then what should we do?" Mrs. Penhallow exhaled, a sigh heavier than the rain outside. "Cease the measures for now. Let her breathe. Let her body find its own rhythm. Do not add more powders, more syringes, more tonic. She needs time, fragile, terrible time." Lydia murmured softly, a name or a word too faint to catch. Her lips quivered, her tiny hands clenching against the covers, as though feeling some dim awareness of the danger she could not name. The mistress pressed her lips against her sister's brow. "I fear I have caused this," she whispered. "I gave the tonic. I gave the powders. I allowed the syringes." "And yet," Mrs. Penhallow said gently, "you acted from care, not malice. The danger lies not in intent, but in the potency of these medicines, and in how quickly the body responds. We can only mitigate now, not undo what has passed." The room fell into silence, save for the faint rasp of Lydia's breaths and the occasional sigh of the mistress. Outside, the neighbors' whispers drifted faintly through the foggy streets, carrying rumors of suffering and scandal. Inside, the Harrow household faced a quieter, more intimate terror, the realization that comfort could conceal captivity and relief could exact its own cruel toll. Mrs. Penhallow straightened, smoothing the folds of her shawl. "I will remain until she is more stable," she said softly. "But remember, no more doses without my supervision. Her body must find its own measure, however slow and uncertain that path may be." The mistress nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I understand." Elsbeth held her tongue, though her heart ached. She had borne witness to too many lives lost in silence, to mothers and children alike, swallowed by the very remedies meant to preserve them. And now, in the quiet, dimly lit room, the Harrow family understood a truth that no whispered warning could fully soften. Medicine could ease suffering. Medicine could also yield life to the shadows. And once the body begins to yield, every moment counts, every choice, every pause, every sigh, because nothing taken for granted can be reclaimed. Night in the Harrow household fell slowly, folding the rooms into a muted, trembling quiet. Gas lamps flickered, casting hesitant pools of light against the walls, their feeble glow struggling against the grey shadows that lingered in every corner. The streets outside whispered with the rhythm of rain tapping cobblestones, distant carriages echoing like soft, ghostly drums. Inside, the house held its breath. Lydia, small and fragile, lay in the guest room, wrapped in quilts that smelled faintly of lavender and lingering medicine. Her body had settled into a morphine-induced calm hours before, but the calm was fragile, precarious, as frost on a window pane in early winter. Each shallow breath seemed to carry her further from wakefulness, deeper into a dreamlike haze, where the boundaries between thought and sensation blurred, where the world's harsh edges softened into smudges of light and shadow. Elsbeth moved silently along the bedside, adjusting pillows, smoothing hair damp with fever, murmuring encouragements that she knew would likely not be heard. Yet habit compelled her. The nurse's instinct, honed over years of quiet observation and whispered guidance, demanded that she act as though every word, every gesture mattered. The powdered remedies lay nearby, on the small wooden table that had come to resemble a shrine. Small packets of laudanum, neatly folded and labelled in elegant script. Tinctures of opium, amber, and rose-tinted. The women's tonic that had already dulled the edges of consciousness too often. And the syringes, polished and precise, resting like silent sentinels. Each carried a promise. Each carried a subtle, unseen threat. The mistress sat in her chair, hunched slightly, hands clasped over her mouth. She had spent hours tracing the bottles with her eyes, counting them as if their quantity could measure the danger that had seeped into the household. She had given trust freely to the midwife, to Dr. Whitcomb, to the instruments themselves, and that trust now weighed on her like a millstone. "They promised relief," she whispered softly, though no one answered. "They promised ease. And yet, see how she drifts." Lydia's fingers twitched, her lips parted. A low moan escaped her throat, delicate and almost musical, carried across the room like a ghostly echo. In her mind, the pain had returned, not the sharp pang of labor, not the corporeal ache of childbirth, but a subtler, more insidious ache that settled behind her bones, curling in the hollow spaces between breath and thought. Each inhalation drew it deeper, each exhale released only the thinnest trace. Elspeth moved closer, leaning over the bed. "Do not fight it, Miss Lydia," she whispered. "Let it pass, even if it must." Her hand brushed against the small of Lydia's back, steadying, grounding, a reminder of the world beyond the dream fog. The mistress shivered, crossing the room to stand beside them. She placed a trembling hand over her sister's wrist. "I cannot bear this," she murmured, voice caught between sorrow and despair. "How can a remedy intended to ease take so much instead?" Silence answered her. Outside, the rain softened to a faint patter. The lamplight flickered. Inside, the powdered dreams of opium and tonic swirled in the air, a fog unseen but felt, pulling Lydia further from touch and sound. Elspeth's gaze fell upon the small packets again, now aware, in a way she had not been before. Each contained relief, wrapped in peril, solace entwined with surrender. And in that moment, she understood fully. The powders did not merely soften pain, they suspended life itself, coaxing body and mind into quiet submission, blurring the line between sleep and something darker. The mistress leaned closer to Lydia's ear, whispering words of comfort. Her tears fell freely, each a quiet acknowledgement of the fragile balance upon which they all now depended. Lydia's eyes twitched beneath her lids, a faint shiver running through her limbs. And in the dim, perfumed room, with shadows curling along the walls and powdered nightmares slipping between sleep, the Harrow household learned a truth too bitter to speak aloud, that in Victorian England, relief could be a gentle thief, and even the softest dreams might carry their own claws. In the dim hours of early morning, the Harrow parlour became a chamber of quiet obsession. Gas lamps flickered weakly, throwing soft, uncertain shadows across the patterned carpet. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, tapping against the windows in irregular rhythms that sounded almost like whispered warnings. Inside, every breath, every footstep, every shallow cough carried a weight of fear. The mistress sat at the edge of the chaise, her hands trembling slightly as she held the rose-tinted bottle of tonic between her palms. Its surface glimmered faintly in the half-light, as though mocking her with its stillness. Each drop represented a choice, a gamble, a small concession to mercy and danger alike. She had begun counting them with a meticulous care born of desperation. 1 drop, 2, 3. Elspeth stood beside her, hands folded across her apron, her eyes lowered. She had been instructed to count with the mistress, to confirm each measured dose of morphine or laudanum before it passed from bottle to spoon to lips. Each count, each deliberate pour, carried a subtle terror, because they were not merely measuring medicine, they were measuring dependency, inch by inch, drop by drop. 4, the mistress whispered softly, voice shaking. 5, 6. The practice had begun as a form of control, a way to reassure themselves that the medicine would not overwhelm Lydia's fragile body. But over time, it became a ritual tinged with fear. Every drop counted was a reminder of the debt owed to the powders and syringes. Every drop was proof of the quiet erosion of strength, of consciousness, of life itself. Lydia lay in her half-sleep upstairs, drifting through the morphine haze, her breaths shallow, her limbs twitching occasionally, as if stirred by ghosts. The mistress imagined each drop descending into her sister's veins, and a shiver ran through her spine. 1 drop could ease a pang, 2 could dull the mind, 3 could erase awareness, 5 could bring a momentary peace, 10 could become a surrender. The mistress's fingers trembled as she prepared the syringe. The liquid shimmered faintly, catching the soft lamplight. Each bubble in the barrel reflected a subtle distortion of the room, her anxious expression, Elsbeth's rigid posture, the flickering shadows across the wall. The sight made her stomach tighten. Each drop was a promise. Each drop was a threat. Elsbeth whispered softly, "Ma'am, shall I steady your hand?" The mistress inclined her head. Her pulse fluttered with each deliberate movement, each careful tilt of the bottle. 1 drop fell into the spoon, 2, 3. She counted them aloud, each number a prayer, each breath a plea. 4, 5, 6. She paused, exhaled, and continued with the same painstaking care. Every movement was measured, precise. The room seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the faint patter of rain had ceased. Silence descended, thick and oppressive, as though the walls themselves were listening. Thomas appeared at the doorway, his coat damp from the morning drizzle. He had come down to check on the progress, unaware of the ritual now unfolding. His eyes widened as he took in the mistress's posture, the deliberate counting, the careful pouring. What are you doing?" he asked quietly. The mistress did not look up. "Counting," she whispered. "Each drop, every drop. I must know how much she has had, and how much remains." Thomas stepped closer. "It is only medicine. You do not understand," she interrupted, voice tight. "Each drop carries weight beyond relief. Each drop steals a little more from her, from me, from all of us. I must see it. I must know." Elsbeth's hands trembled. She could only nod, aware that the counting was not simply a measure of liquid, it was a measure of life, of control, of peril. The mistress continued. 7, 8, 9. Lydia's faint whimpers drifted up from upstairs, caught in the haze of morphine. The sound tightened the mistress's chest. 1 drop at a time, 1 measure at a time, they all counted against time, against frailty, against the quiet, relentless pull of the powders that had already begun to claim her sister. By the time she set the syringe aside, the room felt hollow. Every drop counted had marked the passage of power, the surrender of control, and the creeping certainty that the house, the family, and Lydia herself were caught in a net woven by their own hands. In Victorian England, counting drops was considered prudence, but in the Harrow home, each measured drop had become a heartbeat of dread, a pulse of inevitability, a quiet measure of how fragile life truly was. Dr. Alistair Whitcomb arrived at the Harrow residence just as the sky began to lighten with a hesitant grey dawn. The rain had finally ceased, leaving the streets slick with mist and the faint tang of wet stone. He carried his leather case with its usual air of solemn authority, but there was a subtle fatigue in his movements, a tremor in the edge of his manner that even the mistress noticed. Inside the parlour, the household awaited him with the quiet tension that had settled over them like fog. Lydia remained upstairs, half conscious, her breaths shallow and uneven. The infant slept fitfully, stirred by shadows and the faint echoes of her mother's murmurs. The mistress and Elsbeth had spent hours arranging pillows, adjusting blankets, measuring doses with meticulous care, and now, as always, they awaited the doctor's judgment. Whitcomb entered, brushing his coat and exhaling slowly, the faint aroma of ether clinging to him, as it always did, a perfume at once clinical and menacing. But today, Elsbeth thought she could detect something more. A subtle tremor beneath the surface, the shadow of a man who had leaned too heavily on his own remedies. She watched as he set his bag down on the table, lifting the lid with a meticulous hand, revealing the familiar vials, syringes, and tinctures. "Good morning," he said softly, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "I trust the night passed without incident?" The mistress shook her head faintly. "She grows weaker, doctor. Each dose seems to calm her, but it takes more each time." Whitcomb's eyes darkened slightly. He nodded, then gestured toward the table where the powdered remedies and syringes were arrayed. "We must review the dosages." Again, his voice was calm, clinical, but there was an edge of weariness, a subtle tremor that did not escape Elsbeth's notice. As he worked, adjusting the syringe, measuring liquid with delicate precision, Elsbeth saw him pause. He inhaled the faint aroma of the morphine, the laudanum, the tonic, and for a long moment his fingers lingered over the vials as though searching for balance not only for Lydia, but for himself. She realized with a sharp pang. The doctor, so confident, so assured in his ministrations, had begun to rely on the same potions he dispensed. He swallowed, quietly, a measured sip from a small vial tucked in the case, an amber liquid, faintly sweet, clearly potent. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Elsbeth saw it. The mistress noticed too, though she said nothing. The doctor, it seemed, was not untouched by the very remedies he administered. "The patient is delicate," he said aloud, his tone steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I must proceed cautiously, but the body often reacts differently than expected." "Yes," the mistress whispered, her voice tight. "And we must do all we can," he interrupted, finishing her thought. But his gaze lingered on the vial in his own hand for a heartbeat longer than necessary. He replaced it with deliberate care, yet his fingers shook slightly as he adjusted the syringe for Lydia's next dose. Elsbeth swallowed. She had witnessed many things in her years: trembling mothers, drug-softened sisters, infant cries piercing the fog of morphine. But this subtle dependence, this quiet necessity for his own vial felt different. It made the entire room fragile, suspended on the thin edge of trust and failure. Even the authority of the physician was not absolute when shadowed by his own reliance. Thomas Harrow, standing near the window, cleared his throat. "Doctor, is she truly at risk?" Whitcomb straightened, though the faintest flicker of vulnerability crossed his eyes. "Always at risk, sir. Medicine can soothe, but it cannot repair fragility entirely. It is a delicate balance." Elsbeth adjusted Lydia's blanket with trembling fingers, the baby stirring slightly. The mistress whispered again, almost to herself, "Even the doctor needs mercy." Whitcomb nodded subtly, his gaze returning to the patient. He inhaled faintly, as if drawing strength from the air around him, the faint aroma of ether settling in the room. And though his expression remained calm, Elsbeth saw it now. The man who wielded medicine as power was quietly dependent upon it himself, a physician sustained by the very bottles he deemed indispensable. In Victorian England, relief came with a price. In the Harrow home, that price extended even to the hands that dispensed it. And the doctor, so certain, so trusted, was no exception. The smell hit as soon as one stepped through the doors. A dense, cloying sweetness that clung to clothing, lingered in the hair and settled deep in the lungs. Ether, laudanum, chloroform, all intermingled with the iron tang of sweat and the faint, bitter undertone of illness. The hospital ward was a world unto itself, a place where comfort and danger walked hand in hand, and where time seemed to stretch into long, silent corridors, haunted by both suffering and relief. Elsbeth had been sent to accompany the mistress on her first visit to the infirmary since Lydia's near collapse. The intention was simple: to observe, to understand, to reassure the household that professionals oversaw the remedies administered at home. But the moment they entered the ward, the air thick with chemical fog and hushed murmurs, it became immediately clear that what they had witnessed at home was only a faint shadow of the truth. The ward stretched long and narrow, its windows streaked with condensation from the relentless winter rain outside. Beds lined either side, each occupied by women whose bodies were softened, dulled, or entirely overtaken by the potent drugs used to ease their pain. Some slept unnaturally, their limbs arranged in perfect stillness. Others whispered incoherently, murmuring to themselves or to imagined companions. Each bed was a small island of scent and sound, a personal realm suffused with morphine, laudanum, or chloroform. Mrs. Harrow followed silently behind Elsbeth, eyes wide with unease. She had expected medicine to be a tool, something discreet, controlled, measured, but the ward revealed the scale of its reach. Entire lives were wrapped in glass and powder, every breath, every sigh, every tremor, mediated by a doctor's measure or a nurse's judgment. A young nurse passed them in the corridor, carrying a small tray of syringes. She moved with practiced grace, her hands steady despite the weight of responsibility and the pervasive fog that clung to everything. "Patients require attention every few hours," she said softly, voice distant yet firm. "The medicine keeps them calm, or at least prevents collapse. But one must never underestimate the effect it has over time." The mistress swallowed. "And the long term, the lasting consequence?" The nurse's lips tightened, and her gaze shifted away. "That is a question the doctors rarely answer. We watch, we measure, we record, but the body often decides its own limits." She did not elaborate, though the words hung heavy in the air, punctuated by the faint drip of a leaking IV and the occasional soft moan from a bed near the far wall. Elsbeth's chest tightened. She had feared as much, yet seeing it here, witnessing rows of women trapped in their own softened realities, made the danger tangible. The sweet fog that filled the ward was no mere scent. It was a presence, a witness, a slow erasure of agency that left only compliance in its wake. They reached the far end of the ward, where a bed held a mother with an infant at her side. The child's tiny hands reached blindly for the mother, who barely stirred beneath the morphine haze. The mistress's eyes filled with tears. "This is what I feared for Lydia," she whispered. "Not the pain, but the surrender." A doctor appeared, moving briskly along the corridor, his coat carrying the familiar sweetness of ether. He inspected charts, adjusted syringes, and nodded to the nurses without acknowledging their visitors. The mistress shivered. Even authority seemed softened here, enveloped in the same fog that had claimed so many lives. Elsbeth leaned close. "This is why caution is necessary. These medicines, though they ease suffering, also carry quiet dominion, a slow, insidious control." The mistress's hand gripped hers. "I see it now. I understand." Lydia's weakness, the trembling. It was only the beginning. They left the ward in silence, the sweet, cloying fog clinging to their clothing, trailing them through the cold hallways and into the grey streets outside. The rain had softened, but the city seemed heavier somehow, as though the knowledge of what lay behind those closed doors had added weight to every step. In Victorian England, hospitals were meant to heal. But in the ward that reeked of sweet fog, healing and surrender were entwined, indistinguishable from one another, leaving only the faintest traces of life to navigate the boundary between mercy and captivity. The news arrived quietly, carried on the soft footsteps of a servant who had crossed the threshold of the Harrow home with the weight of inevitability pressing against her shoulders. A neighbour's child had fallen ill in the night, succumbing after a dose of tonic too potent, a vial given without full understanding of its power. In Victorian London, accidents were whispered of with polite restraint. The word death was hedged, softened, rendered almost abstract. Yet in the Harrow household, the news struck like a bell tolling in a fogged chamber, slow, unavoidable, and irrevocable. Mrs. Harrow pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide and unseeing. The room, previously softened by the dim light of morning, seemed suddenly sharper, the shadows longer, heavier. Lydia slept upstairs, fragile as spun glass, and yet the mistress could feel the weight of mortality pressing upon her as she absorbed the account. Elsbeth adjusted the folds of her apron, sensing the tremor in the mistress's hands, though she said nothing. Her mind traced the lines of the accident, reconstructing it with the clinical precision of experience. The mother, the dose, the misjudged quantity, the faint lull of sleep mistaken for relief. How quickly comfort could become calamity. The child, it was a simple tonic, the mistress whispered, voice trembling, given in the night to ease discomfort, and now gone, Elsbeth finished softly, unable to meet her gaze. The word held a finality that seemed to press down on the ceiling, on the walls, on the air itself. In Victorian England, death often wore a gentle mask, a quiet surrender. A phrase like "considered an accident" might be written in ink on a ledger, discussed in soft tones at tea, or murmured through the brass grill of a coroner's office. But the reality, raw, unyielding, was nothing like the words. It pressed cold against the chest, stole breath, and filled the mind with images of the body yielding too soon, the small chest ceasing its rhythm, the eyes closing in an unnatural quiet. The mistress's thoughts turned involuntarily to Lydia. The tonic, the laudanum, the powdered remedies, they all promised relief, promised comfort, promised safety. Yet now the mistress could see the fragile truth. Comfort came at a cost. Each administration, each careful measure, each whispered reassurance carried the possibility of sudden, irreversible loss. Even with the doctor, even with the midwife, even with herself, safety was never guaranteed. Elsbeth's eyes drifted toward the cupboard where the medicine bottles sat, lined like soldiers on parade. Morphine, laudanum, the tonic in its delicate pink hue, syringes polished and ready, chloroform corked tight. Each contained its own quiet menace. The mistress had trusted them, the midwife had measured them, the doctor had prescribed them, and still the accident had occurred. The mistress knelt beside Lydia's bed, running a trembling hand along her sister's arm. Lydia stirred faintly, eyes half-lidded, oblivious to the fear that gripped the room. She was fragile, but alive. The mistress's lips pressed together in a thin line. Relief and terror swirled together, indistinguishable from one another. "Elsbeth," she whispered, "we must be careful. Each time we administer these medicines, we flirt with fate." "Yes, ma'am," Elsbeth replied softly. "Even with care, even with the best intentions." The mistress's gaze drifted toward the window, where the morning mist curled along the cobblestones like a restless spirit. Outside, London carried on, unaware of the fragile balance between life and the shadow of an accident. Inside, the Harrow household felt the weight of mortality pressing in from all sides. Hours later, when Dr. Whitcomb arrived to review Lydia's progress, he approached with calm authority, his voice steady, eyes sharp. Yet even he paused when the mistress recounted the news. He nodded gravely, acknowledging the thin line between care and misfortune, between relief and irreversible consequence. In Victorian England, accidents happened quietly, politely, in the margins of life. But for those who witnessed them, they left marks that no amount of tincture, powder, or tonic could erase. The mistress stood by Lydia, hands trembling slightly, watching each breath, each blink. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, unyielding. Inside, the silence bore down, heavy with the truth that in the era of tonics and powders, of syringes and carefully measured remedies, even the gentlest intention could lead to an irreversible end. In Victorian London, the decline of a household rarely arrived as a dramatic event. There were no thunderclaps, no immediate catastrophes. Instead, it unfolded slowly, quietly, like the fog that crept through cobblestone streets at dawn, seeping under doors, curling into every corner, masking shadows as it advanced. One did not notice the erosion until it had claimed too much: a mother's strength, a child's vitality, the unspoken rhythm of daily life. The Harrow home had felt the first stirrings of this quiet decline months ago, though they could not name it. Lydia's labour, the tonic, the powders, the syringes, all had seemed to serve comfort, to ease suffering. But the consequences crept beneath the skin, around the bones, through the mind, whispering of fragility, of surrender, of a body and household unmoored. By this morning, the evidence was undeniable. Lydia lay in her bed, pale as porcelain, eyes half-lidded, limbs soft against the quilt. Each breath was shallow, measured, as if she feared drawing too deeply from life itself. The mistress hovered at her side, hands trembling, lips pressed together in quiet anguish. Elspeth adjusted pillows, smoothed hair, dabbed damp cloths to her sister's forehead, and whispered gentle reassurances that were swallowed by the haze of morphine and exhaustion. The infant slept fitfully in a cradle beside them, stirred by shadows and faint murmurs. Outside the house, the streets carried on. Shopkeepers opened their doors, carriages rattled over the wet stones, and the fog clung stubbornly, indifferent to human affairs. Yet inside, time had warped. Each moment stretched impossibly long, marked by small, quiet declines. The tremor of Lydia's hands, the faint hue of blue beneath her nails, the sluggish rise and fall of her chest. Each detail was a reminder that comfort exacts its toll, that medicine can ease pain while quietly hollowing vitality. The mistress's gaze fell upon the row of vials, bottles, and powders arrayed neatly on the table. Laudanum, morphine, tonic, chloroform, powders folded carefully in paper, syringes polished to a deceptive gleam. They had promised relief. They had delivered it. And yet, they had also delivered decline. She traced her finger along the edges of the bottles, feeling the weight not of glass, but of culpability. "Elspeth," she whispered, voice tight, almost brittle. "How many more households have slipped like this? How many mothers, how many children, have drifted into quiet decline without anyone noting until it was too late?" Elspeth looked down, fingers tightening around her apron. "More than we will ever know, ma'am. The powders and tonics supplied in good faith hide their cost until the body and mind can no longer bear it." The mistress pressed her lips to Lydia's pale hand. "We trusted them. We all did. And yet," her voice trailed, swallowed by the quiet of the room. Thomas, who had lingered in the doorway, shifted uneasily. He glanced at the medicines and then at Lydia. "Surely there is still hope," he said cautiously, "if the doctor guides us." "The doctor can only work with what remains," the mistress said softly. "And what remains is fragile, frighteningly so. The medicines have softened the edges of suffering, yes, but they have also hollowed strength. This is the cost." Elspeth moved closer to Lydia, smoothing her blankets, holding her hand. Each touch was an effort at restoration, yet she knew it was limited. The quiet decline had begun long ago, before Lydia's labour, before the syringes, before the powders, before the tonics. The remedies had merely illuminated it, made it unavoidable. Hours passed in a rhythm marked by faint breaths, murmured names, and the subtle shiver of a household clinging to hope. The infant stirred once, then fell silent. The mistress adjusted Lydia's pillow, smoothing the quilt around her shoulders. Elspeth whispered reassurances into the air, hoping that sound alone might tether the fragile, drifting woman to consciousness. Outside, London moved with its usual indifference. Inside, the Harrow household felt the weight of inevitability. Lydia's decline was mirrored in the mistress's own exhausted frame, in the tense rigidity of Thomas's posture, in the quiet grief that hung like fog in every room. In Victorian England, decline came gently. It arrived in measured steps, soft whispers, and unnoticed tremors. And when it touched a household, it rarely announced itself with drama. It crept, it lingered, and it stole, leaving only quiet rooms, shallow breaths, and the faint, persistent scent of medicines meant to heal. The Harrow family now understood the full measure of that truth, that relief could soothe, but it could also hollow, that medicine could ease suffering, but it could also claim strength, and that a household, however vigilant, could find itself slipping quietly, inexorably, into the shadows of decline. In the Harrow home, the cabinet had always been an object of quiet respect. Its polished oak gleamed beneath the gaslight, brass hinges and handles meticulously buffed, its glass doors reflecting the flickering shadows of the parlour. Within it were the remedies of a proper Victorian household: powders, tinctures, syrups, and bottles that promised ease, comfort, and cure. It had seemed orderly, civilized, a testament to care, not danger. But as the mistress approached it now, she felt the weight of its presence differently. The cabinet no longer seemed to hold remedies alone. Each bottle, each vial, each carefully labelled package whispered secrets too terrible to speak aloud. Relief and peril were entwined within its confines, indistinguishable to the untrained eye. A bottle that promised calm could also steal consciousness. A powder meant to soothe could stiffen the body against life itself. Elspeth followed silently, her hands folded across her apron. She had long since learned to enter the room with quiet respect, but the cabinet's aura was different today. Something had shifted. Perhaps it was the shadow of Lydia's frailty, or the memory of the infant's cries through the night. Perhaps it was the awareness that, in Victorian England, even the most innocent-looking remedies could carry consequences far beyond their appearance. The mistress drew the cabinet doors open with slow, deliberate hands. The hinges groaned faintly, a sound that echoed in the otherwise still parlour. Within, the bottles were arrayed like soldiers' laudanum, morphine, chloroform, powders of various hues, and small, ornate syringes glinting like instruments of precision. Each one seemed to pulse in the muted gaslight, not with vitality but with quiet menace. She lifted a small vial of morphine, turning it over in her hands. The amber liquid swirled, reflecting a distorted image of herself, pale and weary, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights and constant worry. She could almost hear the whispers, "Take me, trust me, I will ease the pain." And beneath those whispers, another voice, softer, darker, but "I will claim more than comfort." Elspeth's gaze drifted to the powders in their folded papers. They looked innocuous, almost delicate. Their labels, written in careful script, promised relief. But she knew the truth. These powders had been slipped into syrups, measured into doses, delivered into hands unsteady with hope and fear. Each grain had power enough to soothe, enough to destroy. The mistress placed the vial back on its shelf with trembling fingers. "I trusted these," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I trusted them to ease suffering, to make life bearable. And yet," she trailed off, staring at the neat rows of glass and paper, "and yet they have brought us to the edge of ruin." Thomas Harrow entered quietly, standing behind them, surveying the cabinet with a mixture of awe and unease. "Surely you overstate," he said. "These are medicines, not weapons." "Are they?" the mistress whispered, almost to herself. "They bear labels of care, yet each one hides power we cannot measure. Look at what they have done to Lydia. Look at what we nearly lost. Look at what waits in every household that trusts them blindly." Elspeth's hand rested on the cabinet door, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. "Many mothers, many children, many households," she said softly, "have relied on bottles such as these, and the cost is often invisible until it is too late. Strength wanes quietly, minds drift. Life itself becomes borrowed." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "We rely on the doctor's judgment, on the midwife, on discretion." "And yet," the mistress interrupted, voice firm, "discretion cannot undo what is already done. Every dose has consequences. Every grain, every drop, every measured syringe carries responsibility beyond what we can comprehend." The room fell silent, save for the faint flicker of the gas lamps and the distant hum of London beyond the walls. The cabinet loomed between them, an unassuming sentinel of wood and glass, holding not just medicine, but the quiet weight of danger and trust intertwined. In Victorian England, households believed they controlled their remedies. They believed in careful measurement, in propriety, in guidance from physicians and midwives. But the cabinet, polished, labelled, orderly, remained the true arbiter. It bore witness to every choice, every act of trust, every lapse in vigilance. And it waited, silently, to see who would emerge unscathed, and who would be claimed by the very relief they sought. The day the autopsy report arrived, the Harrow household felt an unfamiliar weight press against its walls, a silent judgment that lingered in the air like fog curling beneath the doors. Victorian society preferred to sweep death into polite corners, to disguise tragedy beneath euphemism and discretion, to render calamity abstract with careful phrasing. Accident, sudden illness, unfortunate misfortune. These were the terms used to soothe a world unwilling to confront the frailty of life or the hidden consequences of its remedies. Elspeth was the first to read the document, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the folded sheets. The ink was sharp, precise, clinical, yet the words carried a cold, undeniable weight. Morphine overdose, respiratory depression, evidence of tonic-induced sedation. The child's tiny body, the fragile pulse of life, had been slowed, dulled, subdued by intention or by the hidden consequence of trust. The mistress hovered behind Elspeth, her face pale, eyes wide. tell me what it says," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the faint hum of the gas lamps. Elspeth swallowed. "It says that the medicines, each one intended to soothe, worked too well. The body could not bear them." Thomas, entering the room as the paper shifted between their hands, stiffened. "Are you saying—" "What?" "That the tonic, the powders, the syringes," Elspeth said softly, "they dulled her too much. She did not wake. The body, small, fragile, overwhelmed, yielded to the relief we sought to provide." The mistress sank into a chair, pressing a trembling hand to her lips. "We gave her comfort. We offered her ease. And she, her words broke, unfinished, carried away by the stillness that filled the parlour. Thomas ran a hand across his forehead. This cannot be. The Dr. Whitcomb, he prescribed them. He oversaw her care." "Yes," the mistress said, her voice low, haunted, "but prescription does not absolve responsibility. Each choice we made, each measure we allowed, brought her closer to this quiet undoing." Elspeth glanced toward the cabinet of remedies, polished wood and gleaming glass, now seeming almost accusatory. Each bottle, each syringe, each powdered packet held both the promise of relief and the shadow of consequence. The very air seemed heavy with their combined weight, thick with the lingering perfume of laudanum and ether, like the ghost of 1,000 delicate decisions. She continued softly, "The autopsy confirms what we feared, not sudden illness, not random fate, but the accumulation of doses, the gentle, persistent erosion of life beneath the guise of comfort. We may have acted with care, but the outcome, The outcome was inevitable once the measures were applied. The mistress shivered, turning toward Lydia's closed bedroom door. She imagined her sister lying pale, drifting between sleep and half-consciousness, each breath pulled into delicate rhythms softened by morphine, each sigh a surrender. The weight of the medicines pressed not only on the body but on the mind, muffling instinct, dulling awareness, and leaving the fragile form at the mercy of each carefully measured dose. Thomas finally spoke, voice tight with unease. "And the child? The newborn?" Elsbeth shook her head slowly. The child, too small, too dependent, felt the influence, though indirectly. The quiet sedation that preserved one body's ease can ripple outward. It is why mothers, infants, entire households must be watched carefully, endlessly. The mistress closed her eyes. "We trusted too easily. We gave comfort blindly. And now the consequences are written plainly on paper we cannot return to the doctor's hands, or undo." Silence fell over the room. The gas lamps flickered, casting soft, wavering shadows across the parlour walls. Outside, the city moved indifferently, but inside, the Harrow household confronted the delicate truth. In Victorian England, death could wear the guise of mercy. Relief could be measured, administered, and precise, and yet no measure could account for the fragility of life itself. The autopsy lay between them, inked and undeniable, a quiet, clinical witness to the consequences of trust, medicine, and human frailty. And though no one spoke its full truth aloud, they all felt it. The unrelenting, gentle weight of what had been lost. Dr. Whitcomb arrived at the Harrow home later that afternoon, his usually composed manner tempered by a subtle tension that even the mistress could perceive. He moved with deliberate calm, his coat brushing the floor with the faintest whisper, his bag swinging lightly at his side. Yet today there was an unusual weight in his expression, a shadow in the depth of his pale eyes that had not been present in prior visits. He paused in the doorway of the parlour, surveying the room. The cabinet of remedies gleamed in the dim light, bottles arranged neatly as if to conceal the chaos they had wrought. The mistress stood near the edge of the chaise, pale, rigid, her hands pressed tightly to her chest. Elsbeth lingered at her side, silent, steady, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion and apprehension. "Doctor," the mistress began, voice low and trembling, "we received the autopsy. We understand now." Her words faltered. "The consequences." Whitcomb inclined his head slowly, a subtle acknowledgement. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he surveyed the bottles, the vials, the powders folded into neat, harmless-looking packets. Then his gaze fell upon Lydia's bedroom door, behind which the young woman lay suspended between sleep and waking, each breath measured, each movement uncertain. "I have reviewed the doses," he said quietly, finally breaking the silence, "and I must confess, I had not anticipated such a response." The mistress's eyes widened. "Not anticipated?" she repeated. Her voice was brittle, almost fracturing. "Doctor, she nearly... "Yes," he interrupted gently, holding up a hand. "I am aware, and that is why I have come. I must reconsider every measure, every recommendation I have made." Elsbeth felt a tightening in her chest. She had long suspected this, had long felt the edge of uncertainty behind his calm instructions, but to hear it acknowledged so plainly unsettled her. The doctor, so often regarded as infallible, now stood before them, questioning the very instruments he had trusted, the powders and syringes he had dispensed, the decisions he had made in the name of care. "The body is more fragile than I allowed myself to consider," he continued, voice low. "Even the smallest dose of tonic, the most measured use of morphine, can overwhelm when layered over days of administration. I must question whether our methods, though intended to ease suffering, have instead contributed to her current state." The mistress sank into a chair, pressing her palms against her eyes. We followed your guidance, every instruction. How can it be that our care has failed her?" Whitcomb approached, his steps measured. "I am not certain it is failure, madam. It is consequence. Medicine is not a perfect art. It is a series of negotiations between strength and relief, between body and mind. And sometimes the negotiations exceed our understanding." He paused, eyes lingering on Lydia's bedroom door. "I must re-examine everything. The timing, the dosage, the interaction of each remedy. I must question the very principles I have relied upon. Only then may we hope to guide her safely through the delicate hours ahead." The mistress's hands trembled as she reached for Elsbeth's. "And yet, she is so weak, so very fragile. Can even your reconsideration change that?" Whitcomb's lips pressed together, forming a thin line. "It may stabilize her, it may not restore what has already been diminished, but understanding is the only path to prevent further harm. We must question everything, even what we believed safe, even what we trusted blindly." Elsbeth's eyes swept the room, taking in the cabinet of remedies, the polished syringes, the faint traces of ether that lingered in the air. Each object, once a symbol of relief, now appeared to her as a silent witness, a reminder that even the most careful hands could not forestall consequence when guided by imperfect knowledge. The mistress exhaled slowly, voice barely above a whisper. "Then we must watch, measure, wait, and pray that understanding comes before it is too late." Outside, London's mist clung to the streets like a veil, cold and indifferent. Inside the Harrow home, the weight of whispered warnings, unanticipated consequences, and a body yielding under the influence of its medicines pressed heavily against the walls, leaving every occupant aware that in Victorian England, even the most careful intentions could slide into tragedy. In the drawing rooms of London, the conversation was rarely candid. Curtains were drawn, tea was poured with delicate precision, and manners wrapped every word like a silken cocoon. Gossip was a sport, but decorum governed its boundaries. Yet even within this fragile lattice of propriety, whispers began to spread, questions about tonics, powders, and remedies that promised relief while edging life toward quiet peril. At a gathering in a neighboring house, Mrs. Harrow's acquaintances clustered in clusters of perfumed fabric and polite smiles, their gloved hands clutching delicate cups of tea. The news of Lydia's near collapse had begun to circulate. The autopsy, though veiled in euphemism, had reached ears eager for scandal. Some guests looked upon the Harrows' medicines with horror, questioning the judgment of those who entrusted life to powders and syringes. But society ladies are nothing if not resilient in their convictions. Where suspicion arose, defense swiftly followed. "They mean well, you see," said Mrs. Wentworth, lifting her cup to her lips with the faintest tremor of amusement. "Surely one must rely on the advice of physicians and midwives. The poor child's mother did what she believed was best." "Indeed," murmured Lady Ashcombe, her voice laced with faint indignation. "Tonics are a gift, a boon to women whose constitutions are delicate. To suggest otherwise is to accuse all proper households of neglect." Mrs. Wentworth nodded gravely, adjusting the lace at her collar. "I assure you, in my own home, the tonic is indispensable. My daughters could not endure a week without it, and yet they remain vigorous, cheerful, accomplished young ladies. Clearly, misuse is an exception, not the rule." Lady Ashcombe glanced around, as if daring anyone to disagree. "It is the same with powders and syringes. When administered with care and knowledge, they ease suffering. We live in an age of progress. To ignore the benefit because of an unfortunate occurrence would be folly." The ladies murmured in agreement, sipping their tea with the serene composure of those whose lives had been cultivated in drawing rooms and parlours, where perception mattered more than reality. They spoke of safety, of propriety, of adherence to instruction. Each phrase a shield against the gnawing whisper of doubt. But in the Harrow household, the reality of those tonics was far more complex. The powders, the morphine, the laudanum, all intended to soothe, had claimed their own quiet dominion. Lydia's body had grown fragile under their influence. Her awareness dulled, her strength diminished. The infant had cried through nights, softened by morphine-laden lullabies. The mistress had trembled with guilt and fear, and Elspeth had witnessed the slow, creeping erosion of vitality that polite society could not acknowledge. Yet the defense of the tonics persisted outside those walls. Letters arrived from acquaintances, sympathetic in tone, praising the virtues of careful application. Calls from friends offered reassurance, urging the family not to question the wisdom of physicians or the efficacy of remedies. "It is simply circumstance," one wrote. "A delicate constitution paired with extraordinary stress. Nothing more." The mistress read the letters with a trembling hand, her heart caught between relief and despair. Relief that the scandal would not reach the street. Despair that the very remedies praised as proper had nearly undone her sister. Every word of defense, every polite affirmation, seemed to mock the fragile truth of the household, that medicine, however well-intentioned, could be both salve and thief. Elspeth watched silently, knowing that outside approval mattered little within the walls of fragile life. London society could applaud tonics as blessings, powders as miracles, and yet those living under their influence were left to navigate the shadows, the tremors, the quiet dominion of relief and dependence. In Victorian England, the polite word often outweighed the harsh reality, and in parlours and drawing rooms across the city, society ladies would continue defending their tonics, oblivious or willfully blind to the silent cost, measured in shallow breaths, drifting consciousness, and the slow yielding of bodies under the guise of comfort. In the early days of London mornings, the streets smelled of coal smoke, damp stone, and the faint sweetness of bakeries opening their doors to the rising city. In the Harrow household, the scent of breakfast mingled with the faint, ghostly aroma of tonics and powders, a lingering reminder that life and remedy had become intertwined. Outside, the world moved with indifferent rhythm. Inside, every measured action, every careful drop of medicine, carried a weight none could entirely see. It was at the chemist's shop, tucked between a haberdasher and a lace merchant, that one could glimpse the other half of this delicate web of trust and peril. Mr. Gerard Linton, the proprietor, was a man who wore calmness like a coat, polished and neat. Yet behind his frost-glass windows, among bottles of amber and rose-tinted liquid, he kept secrets no customer suspected. Elspeth had accompanied the mistress that morning, summoned to oversee the collection of a new tonic, and to ensure that nothing was mislaid. The shop smelled of ethanol and powdered herbs, warm and thick, almost suffocating in the small space. Vials gleamed on the shelves like soldiers, each label carefully scripted, each dosage suggested in neat ink. Yet behind the apparent order, Elspeth noticed subtle discrepancies. "Sir," the mistress said quietly, her eyes scanning the ledger on the counter, "we require the same tonic as last week. The dosage must be consistent." Mr. Linton's hand lingered over the ledger, his pen poised with the practiced grace of one who had written these entries countless times. He nodded politely, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a subtle hesitation. With a discreet flick of his wrist, he adjusted the numbers in the margin, slightly altering the recorded quantity. A small difference, almost imperceptible, but enough to ensure the requested amount could be supplied without admitting that stock had been depleted or that previous doses might have been stronger than suggested. The mistress did not notice. Elspeth's hand rested lightly on the edge of the counter, but she did not intervene. She had seen this pattern before in London, chemists who bent the truth slightly to preserve appearances, to satisfy social expectations, to maintain their reputations. Small alterations, no one harmed at least, not intentionally. "Here it is," Linton said, producing a small amber vial, its surface catching the morning light. He handed it to the mistress with a polite smile, bowing slightly. "Use it with care." The mistress accepted the vial, unaware that behind the polished counter, the ledger no longer accurately reflected its contents. She thanked him and departed, Elsbeth following quietly. As they stepped back into the misty street, the mistress's hand trembled slightly as she held the vial. "I trust these measures," she murmured, "but I cannot help feeling—" "That trust must be careful," Elsbeth said softly. "Even the chemist can err. Even those we rely upon to measure safety sometimes bend records for propriety, for profit, for appearances. The powder and liquid may be the same, but the ledger is altered to conceal truths we cannot see." The mistress's eyes widened. "So even the instruments of care may not be honest?" Elsbeth shook her head. "They are honest in intent, madam, but human hands touch them, human judgment errs, and we are left to navigate the consequences." The street seemed colder than before. Fog wrapped around the gas lamps, curling through the cracks of doorways and along the wet cobblestones. In that quiet morning, Elsbeth realized fully the precariousness of trust in Victorian medicine. Each dose, each vial, each record kept or adjusted could tip the balance between relief and peril. Back in the Harrow home, the amber vial rested on the parlour table beside Lydia's bed. Its contents were unassuming, ordinary, yet each drop carried the weight of altered records, misjudged quantities, and human error. The chemist may have believed his adjustments were small, harmless, polite deviations to maintain appearances, but for the family, the consequences could be profound. In Victorian England, trust in medicine was sacred, but the ledger reminded them, even behind the most polite smile, even in the most orderly shop, the instruments of care could conceal danger. And the cost of that concealment often revealed itself only in fragile bodies, drifting consciousness, and the quiet terror of a household watching life teeter on a delicate edge. The nursery was unnervingly quiet. Gaslight from the hallway filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the floorboards, but the soft golden glow did little to chase the unease that clung to the room. Normally, the gentle wails and intermittent coos of a newborn might have punctuated the stillness, announcing life in all its fragile vitality. But tonight, the cradle stayed silent. Elsbeth knelt beside it, her hands folded lightly on her lap, eyes fixed on the small, swaddled form. The infant slept, or at least appeared to. Its tiny chest rose and fell with a shallow rhythm, each breath faint against the ambient hum of the household. But the quiet was unnatural. It was not the serene, contented sleep of a healthy newborn. It was the lull of someone suspended in a haze, a life gently numbed by powders and tonics, administered for the mother's supposed comfort. Upstairs, Lydia remained half-conscious, her own body a trembling vessel softened by the morphine that had become a steady, dangerous companion. Each shallow breath from her seemed to echo in the nursery, a faint tremor that resonated even through walls and floors. The infant's silence was not independence, it was consequence. The mistress entered quietly, her hands clutching the rail of the staircase as she paused to observe the child. Her eyes, swollen from sleepless nights and mounting anxiety, reflected the dim light. "Elsbeth," she whispered, voice breaking, "why does the child remain so still? Why is it so quiet?" "It is not entirely still, ma'am," Elsbeth replied softly, "but the rhythm is shallow. The tonic, the powders, they may be affecting the infant indirectly. The mother's condition, the morphine, it has an influence, subtle but real." The mistress crossed the room slowly, her steps careful, as if the weight of each movement might disturb the precarious balance of life. She leaned close to the cradle, her eyes tracing the outline of the infant's tiny fists, the curve of its cheeks, the delicate rise and fall of its chest. A faint shiver rippled through the baby, almost imperceptible, yet enough to send a chill down the mistress's spine. "She is alive," the mistress murmured, "and yet it feels as though she is merely drifting, not awake, not truly here." Elsbeth nodded, her expression grave. "The infant responds to the world, ma'am, but only faintly. The mother's tonics, though intended to ease suffering, have softened her perception, her energy. The baby absorbs this in quiet ways, through subtle changes in the environment, through the vibrations of a mother's pulse, even through the lingering scent of powders and morphine." The mistress sank to the floor beside the cradle, her hands hovering over the small form. "It is not right," she whispered. "Life should be full, not borrowed from shadows. And yet here we are, offering comfort to the mother, while the child drifts in a haze we cannot lift." A faint coo escaped the infant's lips, almost lost to the whisper of the wind against the window. The mistress exhaled, brushing a hand gently across the tiny forehead. "At least there is sound," she murmured, "but it is too quiet, too faint. It should demand attention, command life, not tiptoe in silence, as if afraid." Elsbeth remained kneeling beside her, hands folded. "The powders and tonics are meant to ease, not to harm. But the line between relief and diminishment is thin, ma'am. And in Victorian England, one misjudgment can stretch across hours, days, perhaps even lifetimes, before it is noticed." The mistress pressed her lips to the infant's tiny hand. "We must watch. Constantly, every breath, every movement, every small sign. For now, she is silent. But we cannot allow silence to claim her entirely." Outside, London breathed quietly beneath the fog and early dawn. Inside the Harrow home, the nursery's stillness carried the weight of a household learning a harsh truth, that the comfort of one could subtly, invisibly, cloud the life of another, and that even the smallest body, the tiniest breath, required vigilance amidst the soft, creeping fog of Victorian remedies. It began quietly, as most stories of Victorian misfortune did. A passing remark at a social gathering, a whispered observation between neighbours, a curious servant's report delivered with lowered voice. Yet from these faint threads, the story began to unfurl, weaving itself through the city like the fog that clung to the cobblestones, wrapping the streets in uncertainty and quiet dread. By the following morning, the case had reached the newspapers, inked in small, precise letters that belied the weight of the tragedy. The headline was polite, yet chilling: "Infant succumbs following maternal tonics, a cautionary tale." Beneath it, the article traced the outline of a household gripped by medicine's subtle power, recounting the administration of powders, syrups, and syringes intended to soothe, to comfort, to ease suffering. It spoke in gentle euphemisms: misjudgment, delicate constitution, unforeseen consequences. And yet the reality, embedded in each carefully constructed phrase, was undeniable. Life had been influenced, swayed, and nearly claimed by the very remedies designed to preserve it. The mistress held the newspaper in trembling hands, her gaze fixed on the small, precise letters that carried her household's quiet despair into the public eye. She had known, in the shadows of her parlour and the whispered instructions of Dr. Whitcomb and Mrs. Penhallow, that the tonics, powders, and syringes carried danger. Yet to see the account laid bare for the city to read, so clinical in its detachment, so cold in its wording, struck her with a force that rendered her momentarily breathless. Elsbeth stood silently beside her, watching the mistress absorb each line. "Ma'am," she whispered gently, "the newspapers cannot understand the nuances, the care, the thought behind each measure. They see only the outcome." The mistress exhaled sharply, pressing the edge of the paper against her lips. "Outcome," she repeated, voice trembling. "Yes, outcome. That is all the world sees. Not the nights spent watching, not the trembling hands, not the prayers whispered into the quiet, heavy air of the nursery. They see only death or near death, and declare cautionary tale. Thomas, who had entered the room silently, frowned as he read the headline over her shoulder. "They have exaggerated," he muttered. "It is nothing more than a single unfortunate incident. The remedies were prescribed by a physician. The midwife acted correctly." "Yes," the mistress said, her voice brittle. "And yet the child's silence, the mother's frailty, the nurse's vigilance, all of that is flattened into neat sentences, the subtleties erased, the fear erased, the living horror reduced to an article." Elspeth glanced toward the medicine cabinet, now neatly closed, the amber vials gleaming faintly in the soft morning light. "This is what I feared," she said softly, "that the world outside will see only danger in these bottles. And yet, within these walls, we have seen both salvation and peril in equal measure." The mistress's eyes fell to the page again, tracing the words with a trembling finger. "Every household that trusts in tonics, powders, and syringes risks this," she murmured. "We are only fortunate that our tragedy has not been complete." Her voice broke. "And yet, the judgment is already passed. The world reads it as negligence, as folly, as a cautionary tale to the unwary." Thomas straightened, his jaw tight. "We must not dwell on the newspaper. It is sensation, not truth. We know what care was taken, and that is sufficient." But the mistress shook her head, her gaze distant. "Truth is measured differently in ink. What was care becomes recklessness, what was vigilance becomes oversight, and those who live quietly with consequence are never seen." Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the lives behind the paper, the fragile infants, the mothers softened by tonics, the households balancing relief and peril. Inside, the Harrow home held its breath, the weight of public scrutiny pressing gently against the walls, mingling with the heavier, more intimate burden of private knowledge. In Victorian England, the newspapers were polite and clinical, but for those who had felt the medicine's dual touch, softening agony while eroding strength, the article was a stark, undeniable reflection. Comfort could kill, vigilance could fail, and life's fragile balance could never fully be translated into ink. By the time the Harrow household had absorbed the shock of the newspaper article, the story had spread beyond parlours and drawing rooms into the formal chambers of Westminster. In Victorian England, such debates were measured, deliberate, and polished with the finest veneer of civility. Yet beneath the speeches and motions lay unease, whispers of infant mortality, of mothers yielding under powders and tonics, of remedies that promised relief while courting peril. The case that had touched the Harrows had become a symbol, a quiet alarm signaling the potential hazards of domestic medicine and professional discretion alike. The mistress followed the proceedings as best she could, though from a distance, aided by a neighbour who had access to the Hansard transcripts. Each line, each phrase seemed both reassuring and terrifying. The Parliament debated with eloquence the necessity of oversight, the importance of physicians' guidance, the virtues of midwives. Yet for every acknowledgement of risk, there came immediate counterpoints: the value of comfort, the proper application of tonics, the need to trust in the judgment of the educated. One member rose, voice clear and polished. "It is imperative that households maintain access to remedies. The gentle administration of morphine, laudanum, and other approved powders ensures that women endure the trials of labor with dignity. To restrict their use is to court unnecessary suffering." Another responded, equally measured, "And yet, we must acknowledge the growing evidence of harm." The Harrow household, among others, demonstrates that what is intended for relief can quickly become peril. The line between aid and injury is thin, and oversight is required to ensure safety. The mistress pressed her hand against her lips, reading the exchanges as though each word carried the weight of her own home. Lydia's pale, trembling body, the infant's quiet struggles, Elsbeth's vigilant hands, they all hovered in her mind, an intimate shadow behind the parliamentary dialogue. Words like oversight, regulation, and safety struck her with double meaning. The abstraction of policy against the tangible, fragile lives she tended every day. Thomas stood beside her, reviewing the transcripts as well, though he seemed more concerned with propriety than consequence. "See, my dear," he murmured, "they acknowledge the dangers, yet they are careful not to impose harsh restrictions. It is a delicate matter." The mistress shook her head slowly. "Delicate? It is life, Thomas. Each measure of tonic, each carefully calculated dose, these are not abstractions. They are flesh, they are breath, they are existence." Elspeth, ever observant, traced her finger along the outline of the cabinet in her mind, the rows of amber and rose-tinted vials, powders folded like origami, syringes polished to a deceptive gleam. She thought of Lydia drifting between wakefulness and oblivion, the infant lying silently in its cradle, the quiet panic that had haunted the household since the powders were first administered. Parliament spoke of oversight and trust, but within these walls, the reality of fragile life was indisputable. Hours passed as speeches volleyed back and forth. Proposals were made, amendments debated, assurances given that midwives would receive further instruction and chemists would maintain careful records. Yet, for all the eloquence, for all the careful attention, the debate went nowhere. Words were abundant, consequences unspoken. Relief and risk were mentioned in equal measure, but the lives affected mothers and infants, suspended in morphine haze, remained unconsidered, unquantified. The mistress closed the transcript with a soft sigh. They speak of what should be done, of policy and principle, but they cannot see, cannot feel, cannot measure what we have lived through. They debate without understanding the quiet terror of a household where life hangs by each drop. Elsbeth nodded. "Indeed, ma'am. They legislate in abstraction. We endure in reality." Outside, London continued its indifferent rhythm. Fog curling through streets and alleys, carriages clattering against cobblestones. Inside, the Harrow household remained poised between hope and dread, acutely aware that, despite Parliament's eloquence, no measure of policy could replace the vigilance, care, and caution demanded by life itself. In Victorian England, debate could be polished, civil, and eloquent, but in the soft glow of the Harrow parlour, words were powerless against the delicate, relentless truth. Medicine, however well-intentioned, could both comfort and consume. The parlour had grown cold, not merely in temperature, though the fog pressed through the windows, chilling the curtains and the floorboards beneath them. It was cold, in that deeper sense, the chill of anticipation, of waiting, of the persistent brush of consequences too long deferred. Gas lamps flickered fitfully, their amber light struggling to reach the far corners, where shadows pooled like dark water, heavy and patient. The mistress of the Harrow home sat rigid in her chair, her hands folded over her lap, knuckles pale. Every inch of her posture spoke of exhaustion and tension. Her eyes, though fixed on the medicine cabinet across the room, traced nothing in particular. Lydia's shallow breaths from upstairs haunted every movement, each faint murmur or stir sending a tremor through her consciousness. The infant slept fitfully, occasionally stirring with a soft whimper, unaware of the fragile vigilance that kept her alive. Elsbeth stood near the doorway, silent, careful, acutely aware of each sound, each whisper, each tremor in the room. She had spent hours anticipating the subtle shifts, the flutter of curtains, the faint creak of floorboards, the softest sigh from the upstairs bedroom, and had learned to interpret them as signs of life, or perhaps warnings of danger. The air smelled faintly of laudanum and morphine, sweet and cloying, and every inhalation seemed to carry both relief and menace. The shadows seemed to gather in the corners of the parlor, as though drawn by the quiet tension. They pooled beneath the furniture, coiled around the edges of the rugs, stretched along the walls like living fingers reaching into the light. The mistress glanced toward the cabinet of remedies, its polished wood gleaming faintly in the dim light, and her hand twitched involuntarily. She had come to see it not as a source of comfort, but as a silent witness to the unfolding tragedy, a repository of both mercy and peril. Thomas Harrow stepped into the room, his coat damp from the fog outside, and paused. He looked from his wife to Elspeth, and then to the cabinet, the amber vials and folded powders glinting in the flickering gaslight. "They say we must trust the doctor," he said, voice tight. "And yet, I feel—" His words faltered, caught in the thick, hovering silence. The mistress turned her gaze upon him, eyes wide and haunted. "Trust alone is insufficient, Thomas," she whispered. "We have seen the consequence, we have felt it. And still, these shadows linger here, in the room, in our hearts, in the air itself." A faint shiver ran through the parlor. Elsbeth adjusted a lamp, its flame trembling, casting long, wavering shadows across the floor. The light revealed the subtle shifts in the furniture, the unevenness of the carpet, and the faint imprint of anxiety that had settled into every surface of the room. The shadows responded, stretching and curling, as though alive, silent witnesses to the fragile lives they oversaw. The mistress rose slowly, her eyes fixed on the cabinet. She opened the doors with deliberate care, revealing rows of bottles and powders, each one polished, labeled, and lined with exacting precision. Yet, even in their order, there was menace. Each bottle represented a choice, each powder a consequence, each syringe a subtle negotiation with life itself. The shadows gathered closer at the edges, and for a moment, the room seemed to pulse with their silent presence. Elsbeth knelt beside her, hands resting lightly on the mistress's shoulder. "They are silent, yes," she murmured, "but the shadows are real. Every household that trusts in tonics, powders, and syringes bears the same weight. It is the quiet cost of comfort." The mistress's lips trembled. "I see it now. Every breath, every drop, every measured dose, it carries shadow as well as relief. And we must watch, endlessly, until the balance is restored, if balance can ever exist again." Outside, London stirred in muted fog, unaware of the darkness concentrated in a single house. Inside, the parlor held its breath, shadows curling ever closer, watching patiently, as the Harrow household understood, at last, the full measure of consequence, that comfort could nurture, and it could consume, that life could hang suspended between vigilance and surrender, and that in Victorian England the shadows often gathered where mercy and danger intertwined most closely. The night had finally begun to relinquish its hold, though dawn arrived over London in muted greys rather than brilliance. A thin light seeped through the lace curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the parlor air, and revealing the household in a new, quiet clarity. After countless hours of vigil, whispered anxieties, and meticulous measurements, the Harrow family had reached a fragile threshold, a point where exhaustion met awareness, and where understanding settled alongside grief. Lydia remained in her bed, fragile and pale, her breathing shallow but even. The haze of morphine had loosened slightly with careful oversight, her eyes blinking more frequently, and a faint glimmer of recognition had begun to return. The infant lay in the cradle nearby, small fists curling occasionally, quiet now, but alive, a delicate pulse of continuity amidst the turmoil. The mistress sat beside her sister, her hand clasping Lydia's with a firmness tempered by fear. For hours she had watched every tremor, every shallow breath, every micro-movement, counting them with obsessive attention. She had measured each dose, administered each powder and tonic with care, and yet she knew the risk had never truly left them. Now, in the softened light of morning, She allowed herself a trembling exhale, a momentary acknowledgement of both relief and loss. Elspeth adjusted the quilt around Lydia's shoulders, smoothing the folds with practiced precision. Her voice, low and steady, filled the room softly. She grows steadier with each passing hour. The measures, though potent, have been balanced. If we continue carefully, we may yet see her recover fully. The mistress's gaze drifted toward the medicine cabinet, polished and orderly, bottles reflecting the fragile dawn. She saw it not as a source of comfort, but as a silent witness to the consequences of care, the tinctures, syrups, powders, and syringes, each one carrying both relief and peril. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She had learned that trust, even in the hands of trained physicians and devoted midwives, could never fully absolve responsibility. Every choice had weight, and every measured drop had consequences that rippled quietly through the household. Thomas stood near the window, his hands clasped behind him. He had spent the night in restless vigilance, pacing the floorboards, listening for the faintest sigh or murmur. The reports from the previous hours had left their mark. Awareness of fragility, recognition of the delicate balance between medicine and body, relief paired with the knowledge of how easily that balance could tip. "It seems," he said at last, voice subdued, "that care alone is insufficient. Even with intention, even with guidance, the consequences are never fully ours to control." The mistress nodded slowly. Yes, relief is never without cost, comfort is never without shadow, and yet we remain, we watch, we measure, we endure. Elspeth glanced toward Lydia and the infant. "In quiet vigilance there is hope," she said softly. "Not certainty, but hope. And life, though fragile, continues." Outside, London stirred fully now. Carriages rolled over the damp streets, the fog lifting slowly to reveal spires and chimneys. Inside, the Harrow household existed in a suspended state between relief and apprehension, conscious of the fragility of what remained and the lessons painfully earned through nights of close observation. The mistress leaned closer to Lydia, pressing her lips gently to her sister's brow. "We have learned," she murmured, voice soft and deliberate, "that every measure carries shadow as well as light, that every remedy, no matter how well-intentioned, demands vigilance, and that even in the age of progress, life is neither fully safeguarded nor entirely predictable." Elspeth's hands folded quietly in her lap. "We have learned, ma'am, and perhaps that is the only certainty in all of this." The house exhaled with them, a long, quiet, trembling sigh. The dawnlight caught the bottles in the cabinet, glinting faintly like witnesses, silent but never absent. Outside, London moved on, indifferent. Inside, the Harrows understood at last that comfort could soothe, medicine could heal, and yet vigilance, care, and quiet observation were the only measures that truly preserved life in Victorian England. And in that understanding, in the fragile peace of early morning, they allowed themselves a moment of stillness, a breath held lightly against the edge of fear, a dawn tempered by the hard-won knowledge of consequence, mercy, and the quiet endurance of life.